Ya, bueno, muy buenos días a todos, muchísimas gracias por su presencia. Soy Francisco Serrano, el director de Fundación Telefónica. Bueno, como introducción, seguramente lo saben ustedes mejor que yo, este año se cumple por una parte el centenario de Alan Turing. Es sorprendente, pero yo creo que ha llegado hasta la prensa, hasta los medios de comunicación, una personalidad tan decisiva en campos como la informática, como la robótica, etcétera, ¿no? También se cumple el 25 aniversario de Christopher Lanton, que fue el que acuñó en Los Álamos en 1987, en un seminario también de reflexión, el concepto de vida artificial. Esos hitos los hemos intentado recoger en un panel que ustedes podrán ver en la planta de arriba, en la planta tercera, en la parte de detrás, digamos, donde intentamos, como introducción a nuestras actividades al respecto, recoger en un panel pues 4.000 años de vida artificial, ¿no? Desde los primeros prototipos mecánicos de los que se tiene noticia en antiguas civilizaciones hasta nuestros días, ¿no? Ese panel y estas nociones y estas personalidades sirven como introducción de esa exposición que supongo que todos ustedes han visto, que la tenemos en la planta 3, que es una antológica de nuestro concurso Arte y Vida Artificial, que lo arrancamos, llevamos ya 14 ediciones, la antológica es 1999-2012, aunque no ha incluido naturalmente la edición de este año, que yo creo que es un referente internacional. 14 años, 14 ediciones en un campo como el de la vida artificial, arte y vida artificial, yo creo que es una eternidad. Las cosas en ese campo van a tal velocidad que 14 años es haber hecho, creo yo, y así tengo la impresión de que nos lo reconocen, de pioneros pues en esta actividad, ¿no? Ese concurso ha sido dirigido por personas que seguramente ustedes también tienen en la cabeza, como Rafael Lozano, que fue el primer director de nuestro concurso, como Daniel Canogal, como Mónica Bello. Y la exposición y en general todo este año de celebración de esa antológica, de ese aniversario, contamos con, también para este seminario, con la extraordinaria colaboración de Karin Ohlenschläger, yo creo que lo digo bien, que fue comisaria de la exposición e, insisto, la promotora un poco de este evento, ¿no? A mí me hace gracia, a veces lo hemos comentado aquí, la primera edición del concurso se llama Arte y Vida Artificial .2.0, porque justamente tratamos de subrayar que había la vida y otra, que era la 2. Eso nos ha creado problemas de sincronización, porque la primera edición tenía un 2 detrás y la segunda tenía un 3, hasta que ya hemos decidido unificarlo. Pero en todo caso no deja de ser curioso, en mi opinión, que en este campo el nombre que ha quedado, el que se maneja, el que incluso se refleja en los periódicos, es precisamente vida. Cuando precisamente el objetivo de nuestro concurso, como yo creo que de las reflexiones que vayan a desarrollarse hoy aquí, es la frontera que va más allá de la vida. Casi por definición, claro, el arte es lo artificial, es lo que se contrapone a lo natural. Si la vida es lo natural, el arte por una parte y la vida artificial son lo que va un poco más allá, ¿no? Y sin embargo la noción que ha quedado es vida, el concurso vida, como si fuésemos un concurso, vamos, a mí me parece estupendamente bien, porque ya está acuñado, ¿no? Pero justamente pone el acento en el componente natural, por decirlo así. Y justamente nosotros lo que hacemos es explorar las fronteras de lo artificial, precisamente, ¿no? Bueno, quería decirles, para concluir, que entre los asistentes tenemos gentes venidas ni más ni menos, entre ponentes y asistentes, de Ámsterdam, de Bochum, en la cuenca del Ruhr, de Barcelona, de Granada, de Madrid, de San Sebastián, de Copenhague, de Zúrich o de Nuevo México. Yo creo, quizás la audiencia es inferior a lo que esperábamos, pero quizás también se incorporen más gentes. Yo creo que es un seminario del que podremos sacar conclusiones que quedarán también como una actividad pionera en este campo, en este caso teórico nada más, ¿no? Bueno, muchas gracias y bienvenidos una vez más. Y le dejo la palabra a Karin. Muy bien.
Buenos días a todos. Gracias por haber venido a participar en este Seminario Internacional Vida Artificial, cruzando fronteras. Quiero iniciar el seminario recordando las palabras de Christopher Lanton, a finales de la década de los 80, cuando decía que la vida artificial es el estudio de sistemas artificiales que exhiben un comportamiento característico de los sistemas naturales vivos. Plantea modos de explicar la vida en cualquiera de sus manifestaciones posibles, sin restricciones a los ejemplos concretos que han evolucionado en la Tierra. Esto incluye experimentos biológicos y químicos, simulaciones por ordenador y los esfuerzos puramente teóricos. Procesos que ocurren en escalas moleculares y sociales que en la propia evolución de la vida están sujetos a la investigación. El objetivo final es extraer la forma lógica de los sistemas vivos, entender su base estructural y funcional, sus relaciones y evoluciones. La tecnología microelectrónica y la ingeniería genética pronto nos darán la capacidad de crear nuevas formas de vida en sílico y in vitro. Y advertía Christopher Langton que esta capacidad se tendría que abordar con los desafíos de mayor alcance técnico, teórico y ético con los que ha de enfrentarse la humanidad. Hoy en día el potencial de simular la vida, transformarla, concebir nuevos organismos y desarrollar sistemas de evolución artificial, tal y como puede haber transcurrido en el pasado y tal y como puede llegar a transcurrir en el futuro, está alcanzando dimensiones apenas imaginadas hace tan solo 25 años. De estos logros y desafíos trataremos hoy y mañana en el seminario. Plantearemos un amplio acercamiento al concepto de la vida artificial que nos permite abordar los umbrales científicos y tecnológicos, así como los campos fértiles y las zonas fronterizas de diálogo entre arte, ciencia y pensamiento contemporáneo. Este seminario se celebra en el contexto de la exposición, tal y como mencionaba antes Francisco Serrano, de la exposición Vida, Arte y Vida Artificial 99-2012, en cuya inauguración han sido los propios artistas los que han hablado de su obra. Sus proyectos se pueden visitar todavía hasta el próximo mes de enero aquí en el espacio de la Fundación Telefónica y espero que ustedes tengan la oportunidad y la ocasión de verlo. Hoy y mañana serán los científicos y teóricos los que nos ampliarán sus experiencias, reflexiones y conocimientos. En su conjunto, este seminario nos brindará una ocasión excepcional para asistir al diálogo en torno a la creciente imbricación entre la vida orgánica y artificial. Y es que, como apuntaba la bióloga norteamericana Lynn Margulis hace 7 años aquí en Madrid, en una conferencia sobre la evolución de la comunicación, para unas criaturas calientes, decía, húmedas y peludas como nosotros, sumergirnos entre oleadas eléctricas y servidores web electrónicos es completamente natural y está en total sintonía con las ancestrales tendencias de la vida hacia la expansión, hacia la contaminación y hacia la complejidad. Doy la bienvenida esta mañana a los dos conferenciantes, Gusz Eiben y Rolf Pfeifer, también a Juan Julián Merelo, quien moderará la mesa. Buenos días. A finales de la mañana. Gusz Eiben es uno de los precursores europeos de la informática evolutiva. Es director de Computational Intelligence Group de la Universidad de Ámsterdam y profundizará a continuación en las investigaciones más recientes sobre la evolución artificial y los sustratos físicos. A continuación hablará Rolf Pfeifer, director del Artificial Intelligence Laboratorio de la Universidad de Zurich, especialista en biorrobótica, evolución artificial y morfogénesis, presentará la nueva generación de máquinas inteligentes, las así llamados soft robots. Juan Julián Merelo, uno de los responsables de la tercera edición de la Conferencia Europea de Vida Artificial que se celebró en el 95 en Granada, asistirá a la mesa redonda con Rolf Pfeifer y Gusz Eiben. Decir que es cofundador y director del grupo de investigación Genoida del Departamento de Arquitectura y Tecnología Computacional de la Universidad de Granada. Después de una breve pausa al mediodía, seguiremos luego a las 4 de la tarde con Steen Rasmussen. Steen lideró durante más de 20 años proyectos de investigación científica en el Laboratorio Nacional de los Álamos en Estados Unidos y participó en el primer encuentro en torno a la vida artificial en 1987. En su conferencia ofrecerá un recorrido muy personal por los 25 años de experiencia y conocimiento en el ámbito de la vida artificial y hablará de las investigaciones recientes realizadas en el Center for Fundamental Living Technologies, que dirige en la Universidad Sur de Dinamarca. Junto a él estará también esta tarde Richard Solé, director del Laboratorio de Sistemas Complejos de la Universidad Pompeu Fabra de Barcelona. Richard Solé hablará de la biología sintética más allá del límite de la evolución. En su conferencia explorará las nuevas maneras de entender los ordenadores vivos, las células sintéticas, la inmortalidad o el envejecimiento que están cambiando con rapidez el paisaje de la ciencia. Tanto Solé como Rasmussen siguen siendo investigadores externos y comprometidos con el equipo internacional del Santa Fe Institute de Nuevo México, un centro que se inauguró en el 84 y en el cual también trabajó y coincidieron en su momento con Christopher Langton. Esta tarde se sumará Federico Morán, catedrático de Bioquímica y Biología Molecular de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid, para moderar el diálogo entre Steen Rasmussen y Richard Solé. Seguimos mañana a las 4 de la tarde con la intervención de Álvaro Moreno, catedrático de la Filosofía de la Ciencia de la Universidad del País Vasco y fundador del IAS Research Center for Life, Mind and Society. Él planteará las oportunidades y los riesgos desconocidos de la vida artificial y reflexionará sobre el cambio radical que implica en la relación entre los humanos y la naturaleza. A continuación, como comisario de la exposición Vida, como experta en Media Arts y como profesora de Arte, Ciencia y Tecnología de la Universidad Europea de Madrid, plantearé un recorrido por el concepto arte y vida desde el cubismo a la vida artificial. Profundizaré en los distintos modos de afrontar desde la vida los grandes desafíos relacionados con la coevolución entre seres orgánicos y sintéticos, entre mundos físicos y virtuales. Jens Hauser, investigador del Instituto for Media Studies de la Ruhr-Universität Bochum, Alemania, comisario de exposiciones, escritor y teórico de Media Arts, analizará por último el reciente giro del interés artístico que nos lleva desde las estrategias relacionadas con la vida artificial y dirigidas por el software hacia los biomedios del wetware. Abordará el fenómeno de la rematerialización en las prácticas artísticas relacionadas con la biología sintética. Entre todos plantearemos, por último, un debate y las conclusiones de las dos jornadas. Sin más, agradecer a la Fundación Telefónica, a su director general Francisco Serrano, a la directora de proyectos Laura Fernández y a Mónica Bello, directora del Premio Vida, el haber hecho posible este encuentro. Y a todos ustedes por participar y estar aquí presente en el seminario. Gracias y que lo pasen bien. Cedo directamente la palabra a Gusz Eiben.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. And the first thing I really want to do is thank the organizers for inviting me to this beautiful place and space too. And this excellent seminar. I was very pleased when I saw the list of speakers. So the first thing to congratulate you with is your taste for good speakers. And to position this presentation, I would like to position myself a little bit. I'm a mathematician, so I studied very theoretical things back then in the 80s. And then at the end of my study, I got very much attracted to artificial intelligence. So that's when I started to move towards more practical things. And artificial intelligence was something already established at the late 80s. And that was also the start of something which used to be called Nouvelle AI, the new wave of artificial intelligence based on evolutionary ideas. So this is that attracted me most, and in the late 80s, early 90s, I started to do something which is by now called evolutionary computing, and I never stopped doing it. So as for today, I will take you for a journey. I will take you for a journey of more than 200 years, starting in the age of Darwin and not ending today. So we will look into the future somehow. And the title of my presentation may be somewhat hard to interpret: Artificial Evolution in Physical Substrates. So what could I mean? For a Dutch teenager, this could be evolution in physical substrates. This is not what I will be talking about. I will be talking about something more scientific, and at the end, I hope you will share my conclusion that speaking about evolution in these terms and looking into the future will also lead us, at least in theory and anticipation, to a revolution. So where do we start? We start in 18-something, where and when Charles Darwin started to study species and the origin of species. And he noticed a lot of things, and he understood a lot of things. He understood it deep enough to form a theory, which is now called evolution theory. And theory here does not mean that it's an unproven hypothesis. It means that it is also a conceptual and scientific framework rather than just empirical facts. So what did he understand? He was looking at species at different places, the most famous being Galapagos, and what he did understand that the outside, the physical setup, if you wish, of animals does change depending on the environment. So he tried to find the link between the environment in a certain biological or physical geographical niche and the physical traits of the species of the animals living there. He was popularized and misunderstood as being the one who postulated that we originate from the apes. This is not what he said. And this is, in this very simple formulation, not true either. But what he did postulate is that living beings do get adapted to the environment they live in. And if the environment changes over time, or these livings change location and thereby enter a different environment, on the long run, this will have an impact, a visible, tangible impact on how they look like from the outside and also how they work from the inside. It could change their shapes entirely. Changes can be as big as switching from living in water to living on dry land. And it can also generate inside changes, like changing the way their metabolism works. He did not understand the fine mechanics underneath. So all he looked at was the outside. He understood it, he made this theory, and we know know it under the name of natural selection or survival of the fittest. So these two forces are very prominently present on Earth and everywhere in the universe. And these are the forces that cause that over generations, species do get adapted. So the Homo sapiens, which we tend to consider as the crown of creation, adapted to the environment in a certain way. It was getting along with all other species until at a certain moment it developed very special features, which is our brain and thinking. What he did not understand is the inner mechanics. It took almost 100 more years to understand that. And I'm sure you have recognized Darwin's face, but I'm not sure that you recognize these two faces. Raise your hand if you do recognize who these guys are. Yes. So Crick and Watson, who first established the structure of the DNA, and they were the ones who introduced the concept of the DNA, and that was the birth of the dichotomy which we now term as phenotype and genotype. This is a very important essential dichotomy in biology and also in the computational model of evolution, which we call evolutionary computing. And the dichotomy, you may remember from high school, postulates that our outside, which is called the phenotype, is encoded by the inside, which is called the genotype. And the genotype in living beings is the DNA, and that's exactly what you see here. The chromosomes, the DNA this is of course just an abstract illustration. So as it happens, we exist on two levels. And what Darwin did not know, that those little changes which he saw, observed, described, and put in a theoretical framework, those little changes do not happen on phenotypic level. They do happen on genotypic level. So if one person has blue eyes, one parent has blue eyes, and the other parent has black eyes, then the child will have either of them probably. One of the properties will get into the child. If one person is tall and the other person is short, then the child may be have some medium height, which is a kind of averaging out. But it does not happen at the level of the body, at the level of the outside. It all happens in the DNA. We know already the mechanisms of reproduction, the gametes, the eggs and the sperms. So that is where the motherly and the fatherly code get exchanged and create a new piece of code which is getting expressed by a new phenotype, which will be a new human being or rabbit or fox or bacterium or whatever. Okay, so this dichotomy is very important. Finally, when this enterprise was finished, not finished, but the pieces put together, we have been able to create something which is called the tree of life. This is the most simplistic picture of the tree of life taken from a from a book which is directed to children. This is a more realistic one, giving much more details. And this is even oversimplified. It contains a lot of information, but it does not map to everything that ever has existed on Earth. So this was the first part of the journey somehow, the past journey, where everything about evolution was grounded in the physical reality in biology. So people who were studying evolution were biologists, or maybe molecular biologists or chemists, molecular chemists. And then in the middle of the 20th century, there was a great invention which is called the computer. And while it's quite easy to identify Darwin as the father of the evolution theory, and Crick and Watson as the fathers of genetics, maybe Mendel would be another possible father, there are at least two fathers of the computer, and on the left-hand side is Alan Turing, and on the right-hand side you have John von Neumann. Both have been named as the fathers of the computer. So what they did, they invented a machine which created an artificial space. It was first created to do calculations, and then as computer science advanced, we finally arrive to a perception, a conceptualization of what computers are doing. We see it as an imaginary space where a lot of things can happen. You can create an arena, digital, virtual, imaginary arena. You can put things in this arena which will undergo evolution, if you wish. So that is what we call evolutionary computing. And now we are in the 70s, 1970s, 1980s. How do you put evolution and computing together? These seem so far from each other, so remote, that it seems very hard to put them together. I'm teaching this stuff, so I have 14 weeks of material. I did not squeeze it into 2 minutes for you, but I definitely wanted to share with you the very basics. There is a basic, fundamental metaphor which connects biological evolution and problem solving in a computer. So the simplified metaphor identifies 3 essential components in a biological evolutionary system. To begin with, we have an environment. Think of the island of Galapagos. In this environment, on this island, there are individuals. And just to be very simplistic, think of foxes and rabbits. And these individuals have a fitness value. They can be well adapted to the environment, in which case we call them fit, or ill adapted, in which case we call them unfit. And the fitness of an individual will determine its chances for survival and reproduction. So mind you, there are actually 2 forces. Natural selection is not simply the survival of the fittest, it is also the mating of the fittest. As we know, you have to be rich and famous and intelligent to get a woman and, you know, reproduce, or for women to get a man. What is the computational equivalent of this? Rather than having an environment like an island, we have a problem which sets up a context. And to give you a specific example of a problem, think of a traveling salesperson, a traveling salesman, who has to travel through a number of cities, have to visit a number of locations during a day, and has to come back home in the evening. The problem here is to optimize his trajectory in such a way that the fuel consumption or the time consumption is minimal. Therefore, the route should be as short as possible. Shorter is better. Then, in this environment or problem context, we have candidate solutions. For the traveling salesman, these would be routes. These would be complete tours starting in Madrid and visiting a number of locations and coming back to Madrid. Each and every route through all the locations you have to visit is a possible candidate solution. And then we have quality, and the quality is simply the length. Short is good, long is bad. And then, quite like in nature, the quality of a candidate solution will determine the probability that we will use this to generate new candidate solutions, to seeding new solutions. And mind you, here is a very subtle trick here. Actually, we turn things upside down. In real life, biology, there is no fitness value. There is no objective evaluation of fitness. There is no rabbit with 215 on his forehead. And there is no other rabbit with 100 on his forehead, saying, okay, 100 says to 200, okay, go ahead, you get children because you are fitter than me. Fitness is something which we, the external observers, associate with them. We count the offspring, and we say a rabbit with 2,000 offspring is fitter than one with just 2 offspring. In the computational model, first we calculate the fitness. Tool length is short, therefore fit, and therefore it can get many offspring. So this is already a huge deviation from the original model, but this is necessary in order to have it work. So in the computational model, we boil everything down to 3 forces. And the 3 forces are fitness evaluation, reproduction, and selection. And as I just told you, there are 2 kinds of selection: mate selection or parent selection, and survival selection. So, to give you an idea how this really works, let's consider the example of this traveling salesman. So let's say it is an internationally oriented traveling salesman, and he has to visit all European capitals, not in one day, of course, say in 1 week. And he has to minimize flight costs or the number of kilometers traveled. So this is the optimal route, but there are so many possibilities. How would you solve this using evolutionary computing? Very simple. You declare that the individuals are tours, and then all you have to do is find out how to recombine two tours, how to create a child. So on the picture you see a red one and a blue one, and of course I hand-made them in such a way that there is a very easily visible difference between them, and I made a child which also visibly inherits properties from both of them. So this is all we need, and then we have the ingredients. So we create an initial population of, let's say, 100 of these tours, and then we start a process of evolution, which means nothing else than calculate the fitness of every individual in the population, select the ones with the shortest length, the highest fitness, to reproduce, cross them over to create children, and then evaluate the children also, and select the ones with the shortest tour length for survival. If you do this long enough, and you don't need billion years for that. It could be a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, a couple of hours, days or weeks, depending on the application, and you may arrive to an optimal solution. So this is how evolution, implemented in a computational framework, can be used as a problem solver. So this is something really interesting, because after 20, 30 years of playing around with this methodology, metaphor, we have learned a lot of things. First and foremost, that we can engineer evolutionary processes. We can tame evolution in the computer. And of course, in the computer, we are gods. So we can do everything and anything. For instance, one of my research subjects back in the 90s was crossover sexual reproduction between more than 2 parents. And in biology, it does not happen. I still don't know why. The biologists may have a clarification for that. In the computer, you can just invent it, try, and see that it works. It accelerates evolution by far. Somebody who introduced me at a dinner to someone said, John Holland invented sex in the computer, and Gusz invented group sex in the computer, which is one of the popular ways of presenting it. And on the very conference Professor Merelo was organizing on A-Life, I had a paper which is cited, overly cited, more than its technical merits would justify, because it is called Orgy in the Computer, multi-parent crossovers in genetic algorithms. So this is an example of we can do anything and everything in a computer, going much farther than evolution or biology has ever gone. And what we have to do is, when we want to approach a problem, we have to design the evolvable objects. What are the guys, the individuals that will undergo evolution? And we do this at the genotypic and the phenotypic level. So the phenotype for the traveling salesman is a tour. And the genotype I didn't show you, but it will be some bit string, for instance, or a string of integers or whatever in the computer. And then we have to find out how to change these individuals. And if we only need one individual for change, then we call it mutation. If we need 2 of them, we call it crossover. And we have 5 of them, then we call it multi-parent crossover. We also have to decide how to make the selection, parent selection and survival selection. We base it always on the quality evaluation, which we call fitness, and then put this all together, and we will get an evolutionary algorithm, an evolutionary mechanism that can be used for problem solving and also simulation purposes. So this was a greatly successful, this is a greatly successful computational metaphor that gave us an awful lot. And in a minute I will summarize what it can do, but one of the nicest things I want to introduce, okay? So before we go on, I want to do a little experiment with you. And for this little experiment, I ask you to close your eyes all of you, close your eyes and try to imagine a very strange, impossible animal. It can be an impossible animal, a non-existing animal. It should be something that does not exist. Did you visualize it yet? Then you can open your eyes now and look at this picture. You may recognize this picture. This is the chimera from the Greek mythology. And this is really not a very original animal, is it? It is impossible, but if you look at it from the point of creativity, it is just a simple, composition of existing parts. It's the head of a lion, and the body of a goat, and the tail of, I don't know, a snake, all put together. So existing things put together in a combination that indeed doesn't exist. Is it original? It's a judgment call. I will show you something which is original, and that's the kangaroo. It has a pouch. And before the discovery of Australia, nobody has ever described or depicted an animal with a pouch. All those strange animals in mythology and all these fairy tales were just like, dragons and chimeras and whatnot. So human creativity did not arrive to this concept. Biology, evolution did arrive to this concept. So the point I'm making here is that biology, natural biology, and also the synthetic evolution is able to come up with very original, unexpected solutions. To give you a technical example about this, let us go back to the dawn of evolutionary computing. And now we are in Berlin in the 1960s. On the Technical University of Berlin, there are two students, Ingo Rechenberg and Hans-Paul Schwefel, who have to solve an engineering problem. And the engineering problem is to design an optimal jet nozzle. And the jet nozzle is a physical construct. It's something for the engineers of an airplane, which produces the power to push the airplane forward. And depending on the shape of this nozzle, it is more efficient or less efficient. So the good old-fashioned engineering approach would be to develop or read the theory in the literature that describes how such nozzles work and try to make some optimization in that framework and come up with the optimal shape for the nozzle. These two students did something completely different. They used an evolutionary algorithm for that, which they called an evolution strategy. And the idea was very simple. They created one shape, they measured it physically, really, they put some air or, water on one side, and they measured the power on the other side, and then they changed it a little bit. In evolutionary terms, they mutated it. And if the mutant was better, they kept the mutant and continued. If the parent was better, then they did it again and created another mutant. So they created mutants over and over again until they got very funny shapes. And this picture shows you 3 stages of the evolutionary process. The very first one, which they thought was the optimal shape based on the existing engineering theories, and then another one halfway the evolutionary process, and the final one they stopped with and put it to the engineers. And this was really something very strange. The engineers just did not want to believe this because it was very strange. It was not symmetrical. It was not nice. It just, it didn't it was not what they expected. The same happened to Andy Keene, who was trying to optimize a satellite boom, some leather-like structure that is holding the satellite dish for the communication with Earth. He also optimized it with an evolutionary algorithm and got a ladder which is completely irregular. It is not symmetrical. It looks like if it was, drawn after a huge party on a Monday morning. But it works better than anything the NASA had back then. And that was also something which illustrated a very important benefit of using evolution. Looking at that asymmetrical ladder construction, the engineers could understand why it was better. And the thing was, they were optimizing it for vibration resistance. So the thing they wanted to minimize is the chance that it would break down. In such a satellite, there is all things, you know, engines running, so there is always some vibration. And if such a dish starts to vibrate, it could break down because there is no air to damp those vibrations. So what they did, or what evolution did, they developed a structure which was not symmetrical. And that is exactly what you needed, because vibrations are waves, and if they meet each other in the same phase, they will amplify each other. If they meet each other in different phase, they will anneal each other. So it is good not to have the same length everywhere. It's good to have asymmetrical constructs. So what happened there is what we call reverse engineering. Evolution comes up with a good solution, which first you don't understand and don't believe, but the facts speak for themselves. And then you look at the solution and try to understand why. Why does this work? What is the explanatory theory behind it? So reverse engineering starts from a solution that evolution brings you, and then it gives you a little piece of theory, understanding more of your own domain of expertise. So this really sounds like creativity indeed, and especially in this context, the question is very natural. What about art? Can evolution contribute to art? And the answer is very simply, very loudly, yes. There is a subdiscipline in evolutionary computing which is called evolutionary art. And I'm not one of the leading figures of evolutionary art, but I have my own experience, and I want to tell you about two of these projects in my own experience. Being a Dutchman, I was always fond of Piet Mondrian. And Piet Mondrian was, in a sense, an easy artist, because at least in one of his periods, or one of his three very prominent styles is very simple, just straight lines and primary colors. So back in the 90s, I got fascinated by the idea of being able to create Mondrians by evolution. So I was thinking about the Mondrian evolver. Could I build a Mondrian evolver? So I just made it a student project. I was working back in Leiden. I made it a student project, and I got a very capable, extremely enthusiastic team of students who were coding their butts off. As I told you, I'm a mathematician, so I need students to do the coding. And then in 2 or 3 months, we had a very nice piece of software, which is the Mondrian evolver. And on the left-hand side, you see the interface. So what does this show and what does this do? A Mondrian evolver generates a very small population of 9 images in a certain style and presents these to the user in a graphical interface right in front of you. And under each of these pictures, there is a little space where you can evaluate this. So you are the fitness function. You can evaluate each and every picture. For instance, the simplest evaluation is binary. I like it or I don't like it. And then you can make it more graded, like bad, medium, good. Or you can give it even more graded evaluations, and a number between 1 and 100. And after having done the fitness evaluations, selection is trivial because the fitness values are known, so the fittest ones will be selected for mutation and crossover, and then the next generation is presented. If you do this over and over again, then you will get pictures that are quite Mondrian-like, except that they are really straight lines and really primary colors. So no art connoisseur would take them for a real Mondrian. And the picture in the middle shows you the dichotomy again. At top, you see the phenotype. In the bottom, you see the genotype. We are not mutating and crossing over pictures directly. We have a piece of computer code that tells us where is red and how big is white and where are the lines. And we make mutations and crossovers in that code. And then we decode that into a picture. And that's an important thing, which is the same in biology and in computer science. Crossover and mutation takes place on the genome. Selection is on the phenotypic level. When you are selected for survival, for instance, you don't die because you have bad genes. You die because, you know, you have, I don't know, cancer, or you are too old. And you are not selected for reproduction. You don't get married to a woman because you have good genes, because she doesn't see those genes. She sees your outside, your personality, whatever, your wallet, okay? And then, getting overly enthusiastic by the success of the Mondrian rover, I went to the City Museum in The Hague. I talked to the director and asked him, would you like to have the Mondrian rover in your city museum, which is a very prestigious museum in the Netherlands, typically showing temporal exhibitions collection. And he said, well, Mondrian is nice, but as a matter of fact, we are just gearing up for a huge Escher exhibition over a couple of months. We will have all Eschers from the globe. All of them will be here in the Netherlands, in The Hague, for 6 months. So if you could do an Escher rover, I would really like to have that. I said to him, okay, give me a month and I will tell you if I can do it. So I went back to the students and I said, guys, I can't give you money. I can give you a very high grade, but what I can certainly give you much work. Would you like to do that? And they said, yes, when do we start? So we started, and a month later we had the Escher rover, which I showed to the director, and he said, I just don't believe it. I want to have it. So we were talking 2000. A flat screen, like this, no, this is not a flat screen costed like 25,000 guilders, which was, I know, 12,000 euros. And we needed quite a few of them. So there was Philips, I'm not making commercial for them. There was some sponsor who was paying for those screens. And we had the screens in the museum. So you had like Escher, 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 flat screen, Escher, Escher, flat screen. And on these flat screens you had images, and a red button and a green button, and a very short explanation to the visitors. It was a binary fitness function. Green is I like it, red is I don't like it. And we were counting votes for half an hour. And then the pictures with the highest number of votes got selected and contributed to the next generation. So that was a great experience. And rather than collective intelligence, it was something like the collective taste. What I did expect is beautiful images, very much in the style of Escher. That one is one of the nicest ones, which again, no connoisseur would take it for an Escher. But from a computer-generated evolutionary image, it's really good. Why it didn't work out the way I wanted, or I hoped to work out, is psychological or social. So rather than just master students in computer science, we should have had somebody walking around with some psychological background. Because what we noticed, fitness evaluations were not consistent. Tuesday morning, there were 5 busloads of school children. Imagine what they do. 2 days later, there were 10 busloads of Japanese tourists, and you know what they do. That's a completely different fitness function. So evolution was, you know, going right and then going left and then right again and left again. So there was no consistency at all. So finally we got nice images, but it was not as nice as I hoped. To conclude the evolutionary art, this discussion, I want to show you one of my favorites with an extremely good title. Steve Rook is one of the prominent evolutionary artists, and this is a picture with the best title. I'm not saying it's the nicest picture, but the title is Darwin meets Dali. So this is exactly what we are talking about here. So, drawing the balance of evolutionary computing after so many years, I could squeeze all the findings in 3 points on the positive side of the balance and 3 points on the negative side of the balance. We can firmly say that evolution can solve problems, and it can even solve problems we do not fully understand and cannot clearly specify, like the jet nozzle. They did not have a good engineering theory. If they had had that, they wouldn't have used evolution for it. Lots of problems do not have an analytical mathematical model, so you cannot solve them by the traditional mathematical, the decent way. So you need this black magic of evolution, and it can solve it even if you don't understand it. All it takes that you can specify fitness. Even better, you don't even need to specify fitness in mathematical terms. It's enough if you have a human who can say yes, good, or no, not good. Even better, you don't even need a human in the picture. You can have them compete against each other. For instance, there are people who are trying to evolve game-playing strategies. So a strategy to play chess or Go or checkers. Checkers is a prominent example because there is a huge book, there is a very nice, there was a huge experiment, a nice book about evolving checker players. And then how do you calculate the fitness of checker players? Just have them play each other. So you don't need a mathematical model, you don't even use a human, just have an arm race among checker playing programs. And then you will get decent evolution and you solve a problem you cannot describe. But we also notice that evolution can cope with changing situation. We knew this from biology, of course. If some animal goes to another niche, it will adopt. It will change its phenotype. So it can cope with changes. Computer implementation, the same thing. And as I argued with these arguments in engineering and art, evolution can find very original, unexpected solutions that can even be reverse engineered. So they can contribute to understanding a domain better. On the negative side of the balance, design of an evolutionary algorithm and setting it up could be difficult. So there is still something like an art to it. It takes a lot of experience to design a good algorithm. In the late 90s, I was visiting a company, and this time I'm not keen on telling which company it was. I was giving an invited lecture about evolutionary problem-solving technology. And there were two people in the audience who were asking very good questions. So during the lunch, I asked them, like, you have done this before, I see, because your questions are far too technical and deep. So yes, we conducted a pilot study about using this technology for our company. Oh, that's cool. And what was the conclusion? It sucks, it doesn't work. I said, no, come on. Can I see the technical report? So after signing the non-disclosure agreement, they showed me the technical report. And anything they could do wrong, they did wrong. It's a typical layman approach. They read a textbook and they do everything according to the textbook, which does not work, or not always works. And that means that that particular implementation they didn't do the job. But they generalized it for the whole technology and said, technology is not interested because it cannot do the job. So this is summarized in this first point. Setup can be difficult. It is still not the philosopher's stone, that can solve everything and anything. There is no good theory to it. Evolution is such a complex, dynamic process that we do not understand it. There are some theoretical results. For instance, I happen to be the first one who ever proved that these algorithms will converge to an optimal solution. And in 1990, when I proved it, it was a small breakthrough, in a small area. But we still don't understand why. And there is another theory which is very, very important and famous, is the no free lunch theory. But on the large, theory is very weak. So my mathematical students are always very disappointed about this, and I always tell them it's not as bad, because think of probability theory, which they all know. Probability theory is the discipline that deals with chances, probabilities, that, in insurance and everything, it's very important. And when I had it as a course on the university, it started with an abstract description of the problem, the technology, and everything was a special case. Playing cards was a special case, queues were a special case, insurances were a special case. So it was a very nice, complex building. But that's not how it started, I understood much later. It started 2,000 years ago, when Roman soldiers, or whatever, Egyptian soldiers, were playing cards with each other, trying to, win some money. And there were some of them who were clever and understood a little bit of the patterns and the regularities of how it all works. Rather than publishing it, they kept it for themselves and tried to make money out of it. And maybe they whispered it into the ears of their sons when they were dying. And for 2,000 years of little pieces collected, In 1993, there was this Russian mathematician called Mogorov who put everything together, and it became a big theory with everything a special case backwards. So I'm convinced that in 2,000 years from now, we will have a good theory of evolution. It just will take time. And the third negative point is it could take too long. For all we know, natural evolution took a couple of billion years from the first, bacteria or viruses to the Homo sapiens. And this is not something you get, funding for, start a project for a few billion years. It has to be done in 5 years or 3 years. And it's a student's project, 6 months or 1 month. But computers are becoming faster and faster. I remember the dawn of evolutionary computing, the first experiments I was doing in the 90s, and now we are doing it, I don't even dare to say maybe 4 orders of magnitude faster. So if Moore's law keeps being valid, we won't have many problems here. So put it in a historical context. Evolution started as a theory, meaning it was a passive and explanatory concept that helped us understand things. It told us about some past process and explained it to us. In the 20th century, we inverted it. We reversed the order, and we use evolution as a tool. So rather than using it as an explanation of a past process, we use it as an engine to generate a new process. This is a completely different game now, and it helps us to produce things, solutions for problems, mind you, in the digital space. It is evolutionary computing, which means that it all happens in the software space. So to put it in some very popular terms, from wetware we went to software, from biology to computer science, okay? And that is the arch from the past to the present. So in the remaining time of my talk, I will try to look into the future. And in order to that, first I would like to get to the issue of embodiment. As the title of my talk says, I'm interested in evolution in physical substrates, so physical medium, something which is tangible. So is there any application of evolutionary computing with tangible results? And the answer is yes. Those jet nozzles have never been really built, I guess. But I know 2 very interesting examples which are also related to art for this. I show you the results. So on the left-hand side, you see a coffee table. And the coffee table was built and designed by Peter Bentley in London, who is an evolutionary computer scientist, especially interested in evolutionary design. And Peter had the ability, the capacity and the facilities to design a representation which encoded coffee tables, to run a whole interactive evolutionary process of coffee tables, and he was the fitness function himself. And then when he was happy with the result, he gave the blueprint of that coffee table to a carpenter who built it for him. And this coffee table is in his living room. So evolution took place in the digital space with the human as the fitness function, but the result was produced, and it's a tangible object in Peter's living room in London. The other thing on the right-hand side is a chair. You may not see it as a chair, but it is a chair. And the one who designed it is Professor Schornerer, Mark Schornerer in Paris. Mark is almost the same description. Professor in evolutionary computing, who had the brains and the facilities and the inspiration to do that, except that he was not designing a table, but he was designing a chair. And as you can see it on the result, he was using a completely different representation. Peter was using big pieces of wood, which were shaped and attached differently. That was his representation. Mark was using very small cubicles that were attached to each other in very different shapes. And the decision of the representation has an enormous impact on the physical outcome. So Mark's chair is much less of a chair as we know it because of this representation. But just like Peter, he had the plan, evolved over time, and he brought it to a carpenter who built it for him. And this thing is in Mark's living room in Paris. So this is the introduction to give a view on evolutionary computing and embodiment. You can put it into a matrix, actually. And the matrix would be 2 by 2. And on the one axis, you would have the evolutionary process in digital or physical space. On the other axis, you would have the outcome in digital or physical space. So you would have 4 options, basically. The first one on my slide is digital-digital. Evolution takes place in the digital space, and the result is in the digital space. So this is evolutionary optimization. It is the huge majority of applications. I don't dare to say if it is 90% or 95%, but the huge majority. And then we have the second option, which is the evolutionary processes in the digital space, but the result is in the physical space. And that is the coffee table, that is the chair, and that is the jet nozzle. Okay? This is where evolutionary art kicks in. And then we have the combination of evolution takes place in physical space, and the result takes place in physical space. Here we are. That's us. So in that sense, it's not interesting. So we are talking about embodied evolution, but artificial. So embodied artificial evolution. And that does not exist yet. So that will be the future. And if you are a sharp thinker, then you say, okay, and the fourth option? What about the fourth option? Now the fourth option would be evolution in the physical space and the result in the digital space. I didn't think it was meaningful. So it could be that somebody comes up with something which fits this. I couldn't. So that is why I skip it. Maybe DNA computing or molecular computing could be this, but probably other speakers would be better to answer that question. So we are looking ahead, and we are trying to find out about this non-existing branch, which is evolving tangible objects, physical things. So, I'm sorry. So what would be the identifying characteristics of this thing? Well, to begin with, it should include physical objects. It's not about some artificial code in a computer space. Physical objects means that creating a new individual really means bringing it into existence. Let's call it birth. And survival selection shouldn't just simply delete a file. It should really lead to the non-existence of that object, which I would call death. Okay? Because we have physical objects, we will have real birth and real death. The third point may be a little bit theoretical, but I want you to understand that in an evolutionary computing application, the computer is God. It is managing everything. There is a loop, the computer loops, and in this loop, every individual is evaluated. And after all the values are in, this oracle, the main oracle says, okay, now I have the data, I know those two will have a child, and those two will die. But this is not how it works in reality. And in evolution computing, the population size is always constant. So if you start with 100 of them, you will end with 100 of them. Survival selection is needed because you have a limited population. So if you generate 5 new ones, you have to throw away 5 old ones. Otherwise, you can't keep the new ones. But in life, it's not like this. It's not true that at the birth of a baby, you have to kill the grandfather. Or that at the death of a grandfather, you immediately have to produce a baby. Reproduction is completely asynchronous and autonomous. There is no outer loop, there is no upper oracle who keeps the population size constant and who makes sure that the births and the deaths are synchronized. So in real life, we have increasing and decreasing population sizes, and so will we if we make this evolutionary concept in reality. Then we have to have autonomous and asynchronous selection, reproduction. And as for selection, there is a very important difference between selection in nature and selection in evolutionary computing. In nature, selection is completely environmental, which means that if an individual is fit for that environment, it will survive. But again, there is no number on the forehead. There is no abstract fitness evaluation. There is no goal. We are not optimized towards, I don't know, composing music. And rabbits were also not optimized to run fast. In that environment with the foxes, it was a feature that kept them alive because they could run fast. So the fast ones got selected and got offspring that was also faster and faster and faster. But there is no goal here. There is no objective to optimize. In evolutionary computing, there is. We want a solution with a minimal tour length. We want a jet nozzle with the maximum power. We want a piece of art with the maximum beauty. That's where it gets a little bit shaky. Anyway, there is a huge difference between environmental selection, which has no goal, is open-ended, and goal-driven selection, which wants to optimize something. And in evolutionary computing, they always do the goal-driven thing. In biology, we always have the open-ended environmental thing. And if we put them all together, then we could have both of them, depending on what we want. Yes, so what do we want? Well, what should we use this for? Why should we do this thing at all? Are there any applications of embodied artificial evolution? When thinking about possible applications, I let my fantasy really go. And I came up with a couple of applications. The first one is not even that far-fetched. Think of robotics. There are two angles to view this application area. One is evolutionary robotics. There is such an area, a very young field, evolutionary robotics, which is typically evolving the intelligence of given fixed robot bodies. So you design the body of a robot, wheels or legs, arms or grippers or camera, whatever. Everything is composed into one body. And the controller, the mind that should drive that body, is too complex. We just cannot simply sit down and cover everything and get a mathematical model. So we need evolution to develop the controller, the mind. That's what evolutionary robotics does. The other angle is there is the design of the bodies. And sometimes it's typically done by good old-fashioned engineering, but sometimes it is done by artificial evolution, but then offline, in the computer. So people may have a simulator which can calculate what a robot with wheels or legs or cameras or microphones or lights or whatnot would do. How would it work? It is all in computer simulation. So it is possible, in principle, to optimize the body of a robot, but it's all done in the computer and then built later on. So it is the second category of my taxonomy. Evolution in the digital space and the result in the physical space. Now we are talking about putting it all together, evolution of the bodies in the physical space, and of course the corresponding minds. Okay, so this could be a huge application area because the robots that we build are most probably not optimal for the environment. Some environments we don't even know. If we really go to deep space exploration, if we send spaceships to other planets or even other galaxies, we don't know the circumstances. So we cannot design optimal robots because we just don't know the environment they should work in. The best we could do, give them the power to evolve, and then see that population of robots on Mars or whatever planet somewhere, make sure that they stay alive for a while until they get adapted to that environment. Second application is much closer to reality, much closer to our body, so maybe even scarier, which is designing functional organisms, medical nanorobots. Devices in the human body are not that old, not that new. This is a hearing aid, and it's not fully integrated in my body, but I'm using it. Many of you have glasses, which is an external device. This is not external, not internal, something in between. But there are lots of internal devices, like a pacemaker. Day before yesterday, there was a huge coverage in the Netherlands of a new device built in somebody, triggering something in the body that helps reuma. The big vision behind this is that medical treatment can be best done at the location where something needs to be treated. So like getting a pill is okay, but it could be everywhere in your body. It would be much better if that substance could be brought to your liver, for instance, if you have a liver problem, and only released at the liver. But then you need something like a little transporter, and maybe even you could have a whole population living inside you, which is just doing some general maintenance. We do have virus scanners for our computers. We may have virus scanners for our bodies. We may have a population of artificial physical nanorobots living inside us, and they have to adapt to our bodies. They have to evolve to our own metabolism, and our own body and metabolism is changing over time, you know, from babyhood, young adulthood, and elderdoom. It changes a lot, so these should also change a lot. There are huge applications there, which of course have very serious security and even ethical issues. But as for the possibilities, this is really something fascinating, highly relevant, which could help healthcare and medical science. And the third one is really very far-fetched, the horn of plenty, the biblical horn of plenty, which is, if you don't know it anymore, it was a device which could produce anything at will. So you could, as you see, the picture is a composition of classical representation of the horn of plenty, which gives you fruit and everything, combined with 2012, which gives you iPhones and Ray-Bans and whatnot, okay? So how would this work? Imagine that manufacturing and production of stuff will be decentralized and localized. We are used to printers. We could just simply say book distribution is fully, book manufacturing is fully decentralized. You just get the book electronically and you print it home at the printer. Same analogy. You don't do this, of course. You read it on your Kindle or iPad or whatnot. You don't need to produce a physical printout of it. But for a mug or an iPhone, you should. So you could imagine a device which could be as big as, for instance, a refrigerator, somewhere in your home, and you could go to the device and give me sunglasses, I'm going to Greece. Or give me a new phone, or give me a new t-shirt. And then it could produce anything and everything for you, within the limitations of that device, of course, and you will be the fitness function. If you recycle that t-shirt to that device in 2 days, then it was not fit. If you don't recycle it for 2 years, then you either forgot or it's a very good design. And your whole family could make use of it. So there will be more fitness evaluations. And these devices could be connected to each other. We could have a whole networked Internet of Things. All these devices on Earth could be connected to each other. So you could have a worldwide web of artificial evolution. This could mean that you could have trends. some fashion trend starting in Spain, and then, you know, hopping over to the Netherlands and going to China, coming back with a mutation and crossing over with something in Brazil. Therefore, I really claim that this technology would be a game changer. This could, and if we did it, would change everything in evolutionary computing. The bottom line is that matter matters. It is really not the same game to do an evolutionary process inside the computer where you can control everything. Everything is so deterministic in the computer. If we want to have a random selection or a random mutation, we have to add randomness artificially to a computer. Here, if we have something outside, the noise is for free. It is always random. It never works like you want it. No robot ever works the same way as you wanted it. I just talked to a couple of people from the Bristol Robotics Lab the other way, and they told me that they were really going mad because they could not reproduce their experiments. They were running experiments, and in science you have to reproduce them and get some statistics about the outcome, and they were not reproducible. Everything was the same except the results, until they found out that it was sunshine or clouds. The robots had cameras, and even though the lab had artificial light, that little difference in the, okay, this room doesn't have windows, of light coming through the window changed it all. So if you go out to the physical reality, the game changes. Other example, did you know that the information encoding you, the human genome that specifies what the Homo sapiens is, fits on one CD-ROM, while Windows 8 requires 2 DVDs or something, I don't know. While you are much more complex and sophisticated than Windows. So how is this possible? A lot of information that codes you is not in your DNA, it's in the environment, or the interplay between you and the environment. So code is placed outside. It's a minimal code. When we go to physical, also the design of genotypes will completely change. It will be not as we will do, as we know it. This could completely change the study of evolution. As a good scientist, I just told you, you need more experiments. Just one observation is not a good ground for a generalization. But as it happens, we only have one life on Earth. So everything we conclude about evolution and life is just based on one sample. If we could really make this work, we could have a second sample of life. We could have a second sample of evolution, and we could ask really deep questions about the minimal conditions for evolution, the rate of emerging functionalities, the rate of emerging structure, the interplay between the emergence of structure and functionality. And to some extent, this would be real artificial life. Everything that is artificial life now is somehow Spielerei, if you forgive me the German word. It's just a little bit of playing around. There is some approaches to it in chemistry and biology, so it's getting out of the computer simulations, but it's not there yet. It will also be a game changer in design and manufacturing. As I told you about this vision of the general production machine, this really could change everything, especially because the whole workflow will change. I will show you a picture later, so I won't go into details about this. And finally, for a computer scientist, it is the most interesting perhaps, is it can change computing and programming. I will also tell you more about it later after I showed you the picture, okay? There are some grand challenges related to this. This is a short list of the grand challenges. The first one is, of course, the body type. So it's fine, okay, go physical, design some objects and make them, make them existing and then try to have them reproduced. But okay, what body type? Should we have robots? Should we have big molecules? Should we have something made of glass or wool or all of the above? You have to design the bodies. very much like you have to design the representation, the genotypes and the phenotypes in evolutionary computing. Design of the bodies is intrinsically connected to the design of the mutation and crossover operators. You cannot do the one without thinking of the other one. If you design some very nice representation or body type, but you cannot have a mutation operator working on it, then it is just not appropriate. So it's always a pair. You have to do both to be able to start. And maybe the most important to me is not only to be able to start, but to be able to stop. You may have heard about the Grey Goo Scenario. And the Grey Goo Scenario is something like some substance that can self-replicate. And then you know the story about the Shah and the chess and the powers of 2, 1 coin and 2 and 4 and blah blah 8, exponential growth. So the thing starts self-replicating, and then in no time it will need more stuff to self-replicate and double its mass again. So it will start consuming the available mass. And you can calculate, depending on how fast it self-replicates, in a couple of days or weeks, it could consume the whole Earth. This is the Grey Goo Scenario. So this is a dystopy. Fortunately, not a realistic dystopy. But with evolution, it can get even worse, because rather than, or further than, just simply replicate and have too much of it, it could change. Evolution is about change. So it could change, and it could become hostile. It could become poisonous. You know, it could become very evil, which is the scenario of runaway evolution. This is definitely something we do not want. So like the nuclear scientists in 1940-something were not really thinking about the consequences. I think we shouldn't make that mistake again. So whenever we start working into this direction, we really should give a thought of, okay, how do we start? Is there a kill switch? And if there is no kill switch, then we have to contain it very, very rigidly. Like, treat it as like a microbiological experiment with the same security measures as for virus experimentation. Another grand challenge, technically, we will do this online design, optimizing or adapting and adopting design features. At a certain moment, we should freeze it. Okay, this is a good cell phone, so freeze it and then launch it somewhere. Evolvability and speed. Evolution is a slow learner. It could take a couple of billion years to get somewhere. Obviously, for these applications, it is not appropriate, so we have to handle the issue of speeding it up. And very interestingly, the co-evolution of body and mind. If we really get robots evolving with a physical body, then, of course, the brain will also evolve. Now we have robot brains on a chip. And it's the same kind of chip we have in the computers, in the cell phones, and in the cars, in the washing machines, and everything. All these processors, embedded computing. The programming language is, made by humans. But once they start evolve physically, there is no reason to limit the evolution to the body parts and not having it affecting the brain that contains, the mind. And once we have evolution of brains, we will have completely different minds on these brains. Our brains are based on a neural architecture. We have lots of neurons, which is really not like the chips in our telephones. And if we start evolving these robots or whatever artificial beings, they will develop a different kind of brain, so they will have different kind of minds. And the thing that's on the mind is the software. And as long as those brains are chip-based, we can call it software, and we can develop it by software engineering, we can validate it and test and debug and blah, blah, blah. But once it gets a completely different architecture, it will get a different kind of software, which we just can't even imagine now. So software, software engineering, programming will also be different, dramatically, radically different from now. most likely we will not be able to write programs the way we do now. We will have to, you know, train those things just like we train our children or our dogs. And we have to test them, examine them, rather than, you know, validate them. So these are grand challenges if we could get there. So could we get there? Well, the answer is yes, 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 we may get there, and there are at least 3 approaches to it, represented by these 3 pictures. The first picture wants to denote the bottom-up approach, starting from chemistry. So chemists know the little things. They know how to manipulate atoms and molecules and building them bigger and bigger and more complex and complex, having properties, features that they want. It could be that the chemists will be able to produce very big molecules that are able to self-replicate and that can be controlled somehow, that they could have something which is just like the software for them. There is another way, that's the top-down approach, and that's the biologists. That is illustrated by the second picture. They start with working cells, which have it all. They can self-replicate and they have controllers, even though it's not identifiable. It's interweaved in their bodies and the structure. And they try to remove all the complexity to make them simple enough to be controllable and programmable. And once they get there, they could leverage on what evolution has achieved over the last billion years, but made it simple enough for us to manipulate. So, you know, there are 2 ways which could meet somewhere halfway. And there is a third way, which I visualize it, you know, as the straightforward way. That's the roboticists and the material scientists, which is the third picture, 3D printing. So it could be that the solution to this, the first one that would really work, is based on using 3D printers, making bodies which are very strange and maybe not recognizable as a composition of parts. It will be not a chimera. It will be something that really evolved and printed by a 3D printer. So this will lead to 2 new games, the pictures I promised you. This passive-active distinction is important. If you think of a Ray-Ban or whatever, sunglasses or T-shirts, they are only bodies. They don't have brains. If you think of a robot, it has also a mind and brain. So it's an active stuff. A T-shirt doesn't do anything by itself, therefore I call it passive. A robot does, and therefore I call it active. So the new game for the passive stuff, this is what will revolutionize design and manufacturing. So the classical way, the biological way of living, you start with a propagule, zygote, and then you have embryonic development, which leads to a being, which could be you, and then this being starts to live, undergoes selection, undergoes evaluation, and if it gets selected, it could undergo also a reproduction. Reproduction means that there will be a new propagule, a new zygote, and the whole cycle starts again. So the revolutionary new way of design and manufacturing is exactly the same workflow, starting with a blueprint of a new T-shirt or of a new cell phone or a new robot, and it will be manufactured, released into the real world. It will undergo testing, and if it is good enough, then it will be able to contribute to a new blueprint. You could call it redesign, or you could call it reproduction. Now for the active stuff, the picture is different. So I already linked wetware and software. Now I'm linking wetware and hardware. And wetware is the thing we know from biology. So we have cells, which are typically very small, which can inherently self-replicate. They can also self-repair. They can self-everything. And then we have the robots that could be small to big. So there are already nano robots indeed. There are big robots like 2-3 meters big. They are programmable and controllable, and they have a very clear architecture. There is always a trichotomy of sensors, actuators, and controllers. And the sweet spot would be if we could combine them into the same framework, if we could have something which is programmable and controllable, never mind what bodies, but it would be able to self-replicate and self-repair. If we could get there, then we would have a completely new game. So now I can put the past, the present, and the future on one list and recap again. In the 19th century, evolution was a passive theory. It only helped us understand things, a past process. In the 20th century, it was made an active tool, a force that helps us producing a new process in digital spaces. And in the 21st century, evolution will be still a tool, but in the physical spaces. It will be able to generate new processes out in the wild, which could be popularly presented in adding one more cloud, saying the transition we have made already went from wetware to software and led to evolutionary computing as we know it. And the new transition that we are heading towards now will go from software to hardware, leading to something which I coined embodied artificial evolution. So I wanted to conclude with some conclusions, and I found that I couldn't call them conclusions, rather closing remarks, to give you some take-home messages or a couple of highlights. Matters. Everything my discipline, evolutionary computing, has learned about engineering evolution is very limited because it is in digital spaces, and it's much simpler than outside in the wild. Remember the genome, human genome fitting on one CD-ROM. Remember the new game of bodies and controllers. It will change everything. Evolutionary computing, which is presently the art of mastering evolution, will have to reinvent itself to meet this new challenge. Second, if we evolve bodies and the corresponding brains inside these bodies, this will mean that the software working on those brains will be completely new. So, giving it a popularistic one-liner, von Neumann is dead. Software engineering, programming are old concepts, all related to the 20th century technology of using chips, microprocessors to be the brains and programs to be the minds on them. Through this development, we will have new bodies, new brains, and therefore we will have new minds. So we will have to revolutionize and reinvent software engineering, debugging, validation. It will be much less programming and much more like training and testing. All this, of course, leads to very big questions. Is this feasible? Can we really do this? During this seminar, you will have really top speakers who can have the best views on it, so I'm eager to hear what others are saying about this. Is it applicable? It's very tempting to say no, because the examples you gave us, they are so far-fetched, they will never work. But then, think back of IBM in the 1940s. There was this infamous IBM executive who said that there will be a world market for 4 or 5 computers. And as of now, I guess there are more computing devices than humans on Earth. Not only PCs, but also all tablets and smartphones and washing machines and cars and everything. So, analogously to that, I don't really know what are the killer applications of the new technology, but they will be there. If we can do something, we will find that. And then desirability. Think again of the kill switch. Think again of, what was the name of that movie? The picture is from, with the dinosaurs. What was that? Jurassic Park? Yeah, Jurassic Park, yes. Jurassic Park, where evolution got over the limitations that the experiment has built in. And evolution just got over the borders the human built in, and they didn't have a kill switch. So once again, this is a huge development, it's a huge change, it's hugely exciting and also hugely dangerous. So no ethical scientist should go towards this without thinking about the kill switch. All in all, I think this will be the next big thing. If you want to know more about the technology, You are welcome to see my TEDx presentation, which tells it in 15 minutes. Go to YouTube and put my last name in it. It's called Tech Kangaroos. Or if you are more technically oriented, get the last number of the journal Evolutionary Intelligence. There's a big vision paper explaining it in more technical details. Thank you for your attention. Time for questions?
Thank you very much, Gusz, for your very interesting lecture. Os sugiero, por favor, con el tiempo que estamos ahora mismo justos, hacemos un pequeño break de 5 minutos. Guardaros, por favor, vuestras preguntas, vuestros comentarios y vuestras sugerencias para la mesa redonda que se va a celebrar después de la intervención de Rolf Pfeifer, que va a hablar a continuación. Os pido 5 minutos para cambiar las presentaciones. Seguimos y después de la conferencia de Rolf Pfeifer entramos en la mesa redonda moderada por Juan Julián Merelo, en la que todos tenemos la oportunidad de intervenir, participar en el debate del día de esta mañana. Gracias. Gracias, Gusz.
think we need the technician.
Vamos a seguir directamente con la presentación de Rolf Pfeifer, a quien he introducido esta mañana, que va a hablar sobre la nueva generación de soft robots. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to talk a bit about our research and about maybe some new ideas on.
This doesn't work. Can you try to?
Oh, this
Hello?
one is there, or is there? Oops. Hello, is the microphone working? Is this?
I don't think it's working.
Is the microphone working?
Yeah.
Now it's
Okay,
working.
great.
Now it's working. Yeah. Okay. This one? Actually both. Okay. So when you look at, traditionally, robots are built from hard materials like steel and hard plastics, and they have electrical motors in the joints. If you look at biological systems, by contrast, of course, there's like a skeleton providing structural support, but most of the tissue, most of the other tissue is actually soft. You know, look at the facial tissue, you look at the tissue in the hands, also the inner organs, muscles, they're all soft to varying degrees. And so there's a new emerging discipline in robotics called soft robotics. And then I have sort of a subtitle called the 4 messages of embodiment. It's called Oh yeah. Okay. It's called subtitle is called the 4 messages of embodiment. So for the last, like 15 years, we have been thinking about the role of the body in the development of intelligent behavior. Now, I'm not going to talk only about our own research, but I'm going to include ideas from many people from the community here, or just a few of them, that have strongly influenced our way of thinking and our research program. So the goal would be to introduce this idea of embodiment and then explore the concepts of soft robotics and what has been called morphological computation. So I'll just start with some background. Now, soft robotics, the hypothesis here is that the next generation of robots will be of the soft kind, that advances in soft technology will lead to a quantum leap in intelligent robotics, and I will, of course, argue why I believe that this is the case. It's already beginning to take off. The theoretical underpinnings will be an understanding of embodiment. Now, soft, what does soft mean? Soft has various meanings, for example, soft to touch, but also soft movement and soft interaction. And what we would ultimately like to have as designers, I guess as roboticists, but maybe also as artificial life researchers, is it's kind of the usual. This has been around for a long time. This is nothing new. They should be autonomous, have sophisticated sensory motor skills, and smooth social interaction and cooperation. Basically, if you have that, I think you have everything that you would ever want. There's something which has been identified as the so-called robotics bottleneck, which means that current robots are unable to operate in the real world. I mean, if you think of robots operating in the real world, maybe you have, the vacuum cleaners like Roomba. But in the real world, what do you have? You have train systems, metros. And there you can see they're really confined to these rails, you know. And what can you do? What can a train do? A train can accelerate and decelerate. That's all. So basically the action repertoire is extremely limited to basically 2 actions. You know, if you have take human beings, they have many more action possibilities in the real world. Now, one of the problems that we are facing in robotics is that if you want to increase the level of functionality, there is a dramatic increase in computational costs and an increasing loss of control. If you have many degrees of freedom, we've seen that in many areas, especially in the field of humanoid robotics, and I'll come to that point in just a second. Now, okay, well, if this is the goal, point is, how do we get there? How do we get there? And here I will argue that it's going to be soft robotics, embodiment, and morphological computation. Now let me start with a bit of history. Historically speaking, there are 2 views of intelligence. There's the classical one, which is cognition or intelligence as computation, intelligence as a computer program. If I may take up the idea from Gusz, Eiben, you know, it's the von Neumann view, so to speak. It goes actually back more like to Descartes, the Cartesian idea. And then there's the more recent idea of you know, an embodied version of intelligence, where cognition is viewed as emergent from movement, sensory motor, and interaction processes. I will say more about that later. Just very quickly, successes and failures. Successes in the areas of applications, you know, you take Google, you have many algorithms in there that have their origin in this kind of thinking on machine learning, pattern matching, heuristic search. And then of course we have chess and manufacturing control, classical control theory. So if you have the goal of developing a useful application, I think this is a good way to go, as long as you're basically confined to very restricted environments. You know, chess is very restricted, manufacturing at the moment, very restricted. If you look at the failures, I mean, if you want to call that failures, that depends, of course, on the goals. If you're interested in understanding more natural forms of intelligence or building systems that are capable of functioning in the real world and interact with the real world and with humans, with the physical and social world, then I think this approach has not delivered and has not enhanced our understanding of natural forms of intelligence. And I think the reason is, or the reasons are, an inappropriate view of intelligence as input processing output, and generally speaking, a neglect of the interaction with the real world. And so what should we do? You know, of course, soft robotics, embodiment. Now, this is the view that I will talk about for the rest of the talk, because the other one, for this purpose that we're aiming for, has actually failed. Now you could say, well, now you're talking about movement, sensory motor stuff, and interaction. Aren't you just doing something else? You know, how does that relate to thinking, to intelligence, to cognition? There's actually a very nice quote by the British biologist Lewis Wolpert, and he said, why do plants not have brains? I think it's a very good question. You know, I don't know whether you've asked yourselves this question as well. And then he says, the answer is actually quite simple. They don't have to move. So of course it's not entirely true. Plants also move, but they don't have that whole gamut of movements that humans or animals have. What's interesting about this perspective is that it gives you an evolutionary perspective. So in this view, the selectionist pressure on the development of brains and neural systems has come from the need to move, to locomote, and to orient in space. And and what's also interesting from a perspective of embodiment during evolutionary history, you always have a complete organism interacting with the real world, having to survive in the real world, having to reproduce in the real world. There is no isolated algorithmic ether in which, you know, some algorithms could have run, but you always have physical brains as part of physical organisms. So it's obvious that if you ever want to understand something like cognition or intelligence, you have to understand how it has evolved over evolutionary history. Now, the field of artificial intelligence, where is basically my background, we have three goals. One is understanding biological systems, and here I'm not going to argue whether some biological systems are intelligent or not. Take ants, for example. I can give you 3 arguments why ants should be considered intelligent, and I can give you 3 why they should not be considered intelligent. I'm not going to give them to you now. You can think about that. So I think it's a moot point, you know, discussing whether ants are intelligent or not. What we do, we find the behavior interesting, and then we try to figure out how it works. Then we try to develop principles and the theory and apply it to the development of practical, useful applications. Now, I think an interesting one is here, is the Enki, the one here, that I like very much. It was developed in Korea, and Koreans, I don't know if there are any Koreans here in the auditorium, but they are known for not being able to master the English language extremely well, let's put it this way. And the reason for this seems to be, at least according to the Korean government, that the English teachers, you know, are not really very good English teachers. So they thought, if we develop a robot that could replace these English teachers, then the kids would learn much better English. And the result was this Enki, and I think next year they have a plan to deploy about 10,000 of them in actual classes. Well, let's see what comes out of it. Should be interesting. Okay. What the methodology that we use, as we call it, synthetic methodology, and the slogan would be understanding by building. So we have a system of interest, like how ants find their way to their nest, how humans recognize a face in a crowd, how humans walk, and then we build a system that mimics these properties. It's an extremely powerful method. And because we're interested in embodiment, we like to build robots. And here are some of the robots that we built. More robots, more robots, more robots, more robots. And this is the most recent robot that we're in the process of building. And I will say more about this robot in just a little bit. Okay, now the 4 messages. So in order to get into the spirit of embodiment, I have a few examples of robots or creatures, whatever you want to call them. Now, who knows Lego Mindstorms? Who knows Lego Mindstorms? Some. Okay. Well, I assume most people know Lego. You know, you can put these together. And Lego Mindstorms comes with a programmable brick. And you can attach sensors, you can attach motors, and you can do nice things. Now, I'm going to play you a few videos. And whenever you observe a behaving system, there is the question of how the behavior comes about. What is the control that is underlying the behavior of these systems? Okay. Here's the first one that I like very much. We call him Crazy Bird. Here's another one. Okay, now the question, what is the control underlying the behavior of these robots? And the answer is given in the lower right corner. So that's it. It's basically the wheels turning at a constant speed. And for all 3 robots, it's exactly the same control. Now, they behave in very different ways, but the control is the same. So the difference in behavior cannot possibly be due to the difference in control because the control is the same. Also, Crazy Bird was doing several things, not just one thing, but the control was doing just one thing. Right. Now, how is that possible? Okay, if you look at this, so you can see that here are some loosely hanging feet of the legs, and on one side there is a rubber piece, and on the other side there is the bare plastic. Now, if it does this, there is a random component, and if on one side the rubber piece happens to be on the ground and on the other the plastic, because of the difference in friction, it will spin around its own axis. Okay? And that's why we also say the behavior of Crazy Bird is emergent, because if you look only at the control, you have absolutely no way of saying how this creature is going to behave. You need to know how the control is embedded into the physical system. You need to know the characteristics of the physical system, the materials, the material characteristics, and you need to know the environment. Only then can you say something about the environment. Here's just, that leads me to already to the first message of embodiment, which is just a summary of what I just said. Okay, now if you are thinking about designing systems, and I think in artificial intelligence as much as in artificial life, we're trying to design systems. And we need a completely different mindset from classical robotics. In classical robotics, you know, you have typically very strong motors in the joints, you know, in industrial robots. If you tell the motor to go to a particular position, to a particular angular position, it will go there. And that's why the people who work in that field don't make a distinction between the control program and the actual behavior of the system. Now, the minute that you have, you know, soft materials, then you will need to think about design for emergence. And then the morphology, you need to think about the morphology of the neural system such that the behavior emerges in the interaction, just as in Crazy Bird. Okay? Now, just, I don't know, are there any neuroscientists here? Neuroscientists? No. Okay. Just let me be clear. You know, Obama likes to start his talk with saying, let me be clear. Let me be clear. The brain is important. Sometimes people interpret what I say as saying the brain is not important. That will be ridiculous. So the brain is important. I realize that. But it's not the whole story. And I'm going to talk about the rest of the story, which I think is at least equally important as the brain. Okay, before I go on, message 2, I think it's very important to understand the fundamental differences between real worlds and artificially constructed worlds. You know, artificial worlds being, for example, industrial environments, chess, you know, things like that, the virtual machine, and real worlds like a downtown area, school, home, soccer field, whatever. And you can imagine that this will give you completely different requirements for the robots. Now, let's look at an example, industrial environments versus real world. In an industrial environment, you have high predictability and programmability because you know everything about the environment. You can, in essence, program everything down to the last detail. Now, this is beginning to change, but that's the classical situation. By contrast, on the other, you know, here in the real world, let's say if we had a reception afterwards, normally we have receptions after these lectures, you know, get very dry, and then you cannot sort of sit here and think about the individual steps or movements that you are going to make, and you know how you are going to grasp your glass. No. But what you do, you just go there and then you react to the situation, right? It would be ridiculous, I mean, to think about what you are going to, you know, the steps, the individual steps that you're going to take later on. It's simply not possible. But this is exactly what you can do in a controlled manufacturing environment. And so you can imagine now the people who originally started this business of taking others, sort of the protection, but you can still see this, no direct transfer of methods. The people who started this were the Honda Asimo people just about 25 years ago. You know, Honda Asimo is, probably most people know that, right? They took the methods from control engineering, in essence, of course, with some modifications, and put them on these robots. Okay, now let me, so basically they tried to transfer these methods. Now let's look at, as an example, at human walking. So you get some human walking here, natural walking, and then if you put the methods from manufacturing onto a real robot, this is so inferior, you get this. And you get this typical robot-like, you know. I mean, it's cute, it's a technological masterpiece, but it's not very natural. If by contrast you look at this robot, which doesn't have any sensors, it has no motors, it has no microprocessors, it walks on an incline. I'm going to play it to you again. It's called the passive dynamic walker because it doesn't have motors, no sensors, and so on. It has some sense of naturalness to it, right? Much more than the other one, even though the construction is really crazy. I mean, it's got the arms attached to the hips. It's got these wide feet, but still, it's got a sense of naturalness. Now, if you, and I assume this sense of naturalness is because when I'm walking, I'm standing on this leg is behind, then this leg has to come forward. Now, what the brain does, it does not control in detail the joints, the knee joints and the hip joints, but it controls the body posture, and then the leg is like a pendulum. And so we let gravity work for us, and the leg almost automatically comes forward. Of course, the muscles do a little bit of work, but very little. So this is on the one hand energy efficient, and second control efficient, because I don't have to do much. Gravity does it for me. And we also talk about, we also like to have our jargon, we talk about exploitation of passive dynamics. You know, I think it's a very nice term. So this is what we actually do here, and because there are no sensory motor loops, we talk about self-stabilization. Now, one way to look at this is this schema. It's not so important. You know, this is the controller, the mechanical system, the environment, and the sensory system. And the passive dynamic walker only uses this part of the system with what here it says, that's very important, the mechanical feedback. And that's responsible for the self-stabilization. The fact that it doesn't have sensors doesn't matter. It doesn't know about the mechanical feedback, but still it's there. You don't have to know about it in order to be effective. Now, a provocative question, where is the memory for walking? Where is this ability for walking stored in the robot? I mean, in humans, it's roughly known, you know, it's a bit distributed, but where's this ability stored? Well, there's no microprocessor. Well, it's distributed throughout the entire mechanical construction of the system, the weight distribution, the length of the limbs, you know, the feet, the frictional properties, and so on. At Cornell University, Andy Arena and his team developed the Cornell Ranger. They also developed the passive dynamic walker. Now, they developed the Cornell Ranger, and the amazing thing is that with one, let me just show. I mean, it's a very strange robot. Funny construction. Right? Okay, now I think the amazing thing here is because they're exploiting the passive dynamics, and you know, it's a very nice construction. With one single battery charge, you can actually walk for 65 kilometers. Nobody would have thought this to be possible. If you look at Honda Asimo, it does maybe, I don't know, 1 kilometer at most on one battery charge. This one does 65. It's extremely, And you know, there's very, very little control and very, very little sensing, basically just the contact sensor on the ground that tells it, okay, now you're on the ground, move the other legs forward. So this is, So this is control of locomotion by exploitation of passive dynamics. And by contrast, you have full control here. So this leads us already to message 3 of embodiment. There is a task distribution between the brain, the control, the body, morphology, materials, and the environment. As we've seen, you know, it's distributed through the environment. Now, what's happening here is basically, and I think Gusz was alluding to this point towards the end of his talk, there is no longer a clear separation between the control and the hardware, especially if you have soft components. You know, when you're walking, for example, or running, and on, maybe I have to go over here, on impact, you know, basically there is this elastic movement, but this elastic movement is not controlled by the brain directly. What the brain does, it sets the stiffness of the muscles on impact, high stiffness on impact and lower stiffness when the leg is swinging forward. So part of the control is outsourced to the material properties, to the stiffness of the muscles. So the brain dynamically changes the stiffness of the muscles, thus greatly facilitating the control problem. And this, so part of the control is in the morphological and material characteristics. That's why we talk about morphological computation. It's a control engineer's nightmare, so to speak. And now let me give you a few case studies for designed for emergence. A couple of years ago, we built a robot called Stumpy. It's a strange creature. It only has 2 degrees of freedom. Basically, you can do this movement, and this movement. And that's it. Now, if you do that right, if you have the right distribution, weight distribution, morphology, and so on, then you can do nice things. Also, the behavior of Stumpy is not programmed, but it's emergent. So let me just, to give you a feel for how this goes, we built, I think, 12 or 15 of them and made a choreography. And here is how it goes. And so on, and so on. So I think it's very nice the way it moves. Also, this movement, if you look at the control program, you know, a movement like that, you don't find it in the control program. You have to know how the control program is embedded into the physical system and the springy properties and so on, right? Okay. Another example is the robot frog from the University of Tokyo. It's built with pneumatic actuators, that air muscles. Now watch this. This is the slow motion. So this, you see this damped oscillatory movement. That's not controlled. That's only the characteristics of these air muscles, you know, which have a rubber tube, and this rubbery material has damping characteristics. So the damping functionality, the damped oscillation, is purely a matter of the morphology and the material properties. It's not controlled by some control program. So I think it's also a very nice example. And so we talk about morphological computation, and I really think we have to rethink our notion of control, because now we don't have this clear separation anymore. And it has been suggested that the better term would actually be orchestration. You orchestrate movement rather than control movement, because if you talk about control, you have to be able to identify the controller and the to be controlled. Now let me give you an example of orchestration of movements. When you think about grasping a hard object like this, right? It's very easy for us to do, but for robots it's not so easy. And if you look at this, so grasping hard objects, what's happening is, first of all, I can just apply a particular force, and then the fingers will wrap around objects of any shape. It's a kind of self-adaptation. You don't need to control very much, just the force. Moreover, the tissue in the fingers in the hand and on the fingertips is soft. And if I do this, it passively deforms and adapts to the shape of the object, thereby increasing the contact surface. And because the skin is always a bit humid, you got the right frictional characteristics. And so holding a hard object like a glass is very easy for us to do. But a lot of the task, a large part of the task, is accomplished by the morphology and the material characteristics, not only by the control. That's why this concept of morphological computation is so important. Now, I've been talking mostly about the motor system. A similar story applies to the sensory system. For example, in insects, here you see insects, they have a non-homogeneous arrangement of the facets, which gives you computational power. I don't go into the details. I'm happy to explain that to you if you like. There is a whole research field called space variant dynamic vision and neuromorphic engineering. If you look at the human retina, for example, the spacing of the receptor cells is very non-homogeneous, so you have a much higher density in the center and less density in the periphery, but in the periphery they're better at detecting movement, which also is important from an evolutionary perspective. Again, a case of morphological computation. Okay, now I talked about stupid robot. Of course, we want to make them more intelligent. The obvious thing to do is to add sensors, right? And you can add sensors that give you information about the environment, or sensors that, proprioceptive sensors that give you information about the organism or the system itself. Now that's obvious, everybody does that, nothing new. I think what's interesting is that through our movements, every action that we perform has as a consequence a pattern of sensory stimulation. So when I move, I walk, let's say I walk, then the environment travels across the visual field. So I induce sensory stimulation, optic flow, technical term, and I induce this sensory stimulation because I'm walking, because I'm physically interacting with the environment. When I grasp this glass, as before, I am inducing visual stimulation, you know, bringing it into the center of the visual field. I'm inducing proprioceptive stimulation. I can feel how heavy it is, and I have a very high density of sensors in the hand. So by doing this, I'm actively generating a pattern of sensory stimulation. It's not just input. I think input is the wrong term. It's a completely misleading term, and that's a fundamental difference to a computer. A computer is basically sitting there waiting for me to push one of the keys. But biological systems continuously generate patterns of sensory stimulation through their own interactions. And what's happening is also, in a sense, these patterns of sensory stimulation constitute the raw material for the brain to process and to learn something about the environment. Right? So you see that there is a very direct relation of the physical interaction with the environment and the information processing of the brain. What's also interesting to note is that there is induction of correlations in different sensory channels. What does that mean? It means that I can, for example, learn, if I take this glass again, that over time we have to learn that during our ontogenetic development, by looking at the glass, I can learn that I already have an expectation of what it will feel like when I actually grasp the glass. You know, it's going to be cold, it's going to be, you know, the texture, or roughly the weight. And these expectations are extremely important for motor control, because they tell me whether my action has been successful or not. And we always have these expectations. They're extremely important. And you know, on New Year's Eve, they have these stupid glasses that are glued to the table. And then you try to grasp a glass, and then you realize that you actually had an expectation roughly how heavy the glass would be. But we only realize that we had the expectations if they're not fulfilled. Or you basically go into a hole while in the road while walking. Okay, now some of the stuff, I think the information theoretic interpretation is new, but we also talk about self-structuring of sensory data through physical interaction with the world. And I think that's really the prerequisite for learning. Now, some of these ideas have been around for a long time. I mean, look at this, John Dewey, you know, an American pragmatist and, you know, philosopher and educator, 1896. That's not a typo. It's century before last. It's actually interesting if you read this paper, very influential paper. I think the title is something like The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology. You think that he is arguing against the computer in metaphor for human intelligence. It's amazing. Okay, now let's talk more about soft robotics. So soft robotics already forced us to rethink the notion of control. Let's look more at, you know, here, next step. So we built, in the context of a European project, we built this robot, este, which obviously stands for embodied cognition in a compliantly engineered robot. And instead of only mimicking the superficial structure of the human, we try to also mimic the inner structure, the skeleton, the tendons, the muscles, and the joints. And so this is a fully tendon-driven system, which for robots, I mean, hands are often tendon-driven. And why is that good? Well, because you don't need to have the motors in the joints, but you can have the motors somewhere else, so you don't have to have the weight on the end effector, actually. And it's been traveling all over the world. I'm not going to go through everything. Not everybody is very happy about this. If you look at this guy, for example. Yeah. Okay, so, and this is the former president of Switzerland shaking hands with a robot. Okay, now to give you a feel of how this robot moves, and I mean, why is that interesting? If you perform a movement like this, like lifting your elbow like this, lifting your arm like this, many muscles need to be coordinated, and they need to be actuated to varying extents, right? Some more, some less. Now, we've somehow learned that. We don't even realize that we're coordinating many muscles. But if you have a robot with about 50 muscles like this one, which ones do you have to actuate to what degree? You know, so you sit down and basically this one, this much, this one, this much, this one. And for every individual movement, and the movement is slightly different, then, you know, everything's slightly different. So that's not going to work. So I think we need to have learning mechanisms. But just to give you a feel of what the movements of this robot are like. Okay, yeah. Now the next generation is going to be this one. It's going to be much smaller. It's going to be, but no revolutionary technology. But we're going to build it very quickly. So the idea is also we use crowdfunding for this, and you know, there's a website that you can. And you can participate in the so this was basically an ad to motivate you to go to the website and to also sponsor the development of this robot. I don't like the face the way it is now with this scale. It's too much like a skull, you know, like pirates. And so we had some alternative designs made, and this was put on a website and people could vote which one they liked best. And it seems actually that this one is the winner. So we're probably going to use that one for the face. Now you can also follow the robot's development on the website. Okay. Now this problem with systems that have very many degrees of freedom is also known as Bernstein's problem. Russian physiologists who thought about the issue of how babies manage to control a body with so many degrees of freedom, how to orchestrate these movements. And there's indeed, for roboticists, a complexity barrier. There are various approaches. We use what we call a developmental approach, so we want to mimic this development as well. And there are various techniques that I don't have time to go into now. Okay, so if you look at soft robotics, then all of a sudden you don't have the robot and the control, so your design space includes materials. You know, you can have soft materials, you can have materials with changeable properties, you know, muscle stiffness, for example, and so on. There are also trade-offs. For example, if you look at an insect eye, as I mentioned before, they have a non-homogeneous arrangement of the facets in the insect eye, which is good for some tasks, but maybe not so good for other tasks. So in some sense, you gain efficiency, but you lose flexibility. So there's a trade-off there. Now, if you have changeable morphologies, then you can regain part of that flexibility, right? But you see the design space gets much more complex, and we're trying to sort of understand a little bit this design space. Now, if you look at this, on the left side here, you have, let's say, the pure algorithm. And you know, here you already have the computer. Here you have the classical industrial robot, where you have a very clear separation between control and robot. Now, the more you go over in this direction, for example, in the Ranger, Cornell Ranger, you have very little control, and most of it is just in the dynamics of the system. And so morphology becomes dominant. There is also an increasing dependence on the environment. Also processes of, let's see, maybe in the next slide, processes of self-organization. Do I have that? Processes of self-organization get more important. And Gusz was talking about very small robots, like on this side. I will show you an example in a second. Here we have cells, molecules. So if you look at the level of molecules, all you have is morphology. You have charge distribution, and you have shape. And that's basically what you have. And so the more you get in this direction, the more processes of self-organization start playing a role, and then you can no longer think about this in terms of classical control. But we also talk about guided self-organization. You can sort of, well, self-organization, you can exploit that, and you try to sort of manipulate some global parameters in there. Now, you may think that on this side, it's not very interesting what you can do. I would like to show you an example of the so-called tribalons that a former PhD student of mine, Shuhei Miyashita, did. He's now at MIT. And he built these so-called tribalons. Now, here is a white triangle. They swim on water. They're about 3 to 4 centimeters. They have a magnet, and they have a vibration motor, this white one. So they swim on water and electrolyte. And then you have the green discs here, and they only have a magnet. And I'm going to show you a video now that shows what I call the self-assembled emergent bicycle. Oops. It's called the self-assembled emergent bicycle. How do I get to just a second. Oh no, here, right, so this one, let me just, yeah. Oops, you can't see it, oops, I have to, sorry. I have to do this again. Let me just quickly start this. Okay, so that was with the motor and with the magnet, and now the green discs are purely passive. And now he switches on the motor only of this triangle, and watch this. And now for some reason there is a disturbance, and sure enough you get the bicycle. So there's absolutely no control in this. This is only self-organization. But still, you do get very interesting, not only structures, but behaving systems. So that's the emergent bicycle. Okay, let me see. Okay. So there's no control, you only have morphology. So that's basically on this side, and you can see that we do have interesting stuff happening there. And I think because we have a current lack of understanding of this design space, what we do is we use evolutionary methods, hoping that they will give us some interesting ideas about how to design our systems. And I think, to my knowledge, this is so far, you know, sort of the best, most powerful methods that we can use. And one of my former PhD students, Josh Bongard, he developed these block pushers, which are based on models of genetic regulatory networks. Now, most of the time, what people do in evolutionary robotics is they take a robot and they evolve a controller for the robot, like typically a neural network. Now, if you look at biological evolution, well, it's rarely the case that there has been a body and then a brain has been evolved for this particular body, but there's a co-evolution of the control and of the body. And most of the time, people specify parameters, you know, parameters of the phenotype, like the length of the limbs, the diameter of the limbs, the type of the joints, which is called a parameterized approach. Now, this is genetic regulatory networks, something very different. And he has a process of ontogenetic development. And I'm going to play you a video. I hope that this time, these videos are very large, so I couldn't include them in the presentation. I would like to show you, it's a beautiful video that shows what you can actually do. I know that some of you have seen that before. Some of you have seen that before. Yeah.
Artificial ontogeny is a system for automatically evolving virtual robots or agents in a three-dimensional physics-based simulation for various user-defined tasks. In our first set of experiments, we evolved agents to push a large block in their environment as far as possible during a fixed time period. Here we see an agent growing from a single starting sphere into a set of connected spheres. These spheres are loosely modeled on biological cells, but also serve as the basic mechanical unit from which the agent is constructed. Each unit contains a complete copy of the genetic information shaping the growth of the agent, as well as sensors, motors, and neural structure. As these units grow and divide, so too does the neural structure grow inside the developing body. The agent shown here was extracted from one evolutionary run after 2 hours. At this point, artificial ontogeny has discovered how to grow the brain and body of the agent together to achieve an inchworm method of locomotion. This agent is a descendant of the previous one and appeared in the evolving population after a further 2 hours had elapsed. Here, evolution has discovered that increased mass allows the agent to exert more force against the block.
Right, so I think...
Also, the inchworm method of locomotion has been modified to create a long appendage that pushes against the block.
You can see...
White units contain both sensors and motors. Light gray...
Okay, I think you see how it goes, so let's go back. So this is an extremely powerful method to actually use these models of genetic regulatory networks. Now, the last part is going to be about what I call the power of materials. Now, let's just look at this. It's a very simple robot. It only has 1 degree of freedom. If you get the right materials for the tail fin, you get very natural swimming movements. And then a paradigmatic soft robotics project is, of course, the Octopus project, an EU project. And you see here some of the movements. This is a prototype of a robot arm. It's interesting because it's got potentially infinitely many degrees of freedom. You cannot use classical control theory. You have to think differently about the control problem. And here is just, I mean, I go through this very quickly. It's a bit technical. The idea is that you can actually use neural networks here, what's called reservoir computing, to control the robot in a very easy fashion. And here I'm just showing a locomotion movement in water. In water that was evolved, learned through this reservoir computing approach. Now it sort of has a omnidirectional camera. It can see the green spot and it will move towards the green spot. We didn't have to program anything here, basically just a neural network that learned this particular movement. You can also use this for computation, and you can use it for function, the octopus arm, you can use it for function approximation. You can do the classical benchmarks, and it's almost perfect, the function approximation, but I won't say more about that. So now we put sensors into the octopus arm and use the actual physical octopus arm. We use the actual physical octopus arm for computation. And I mean, Gusz before mentioned bye-bye von Neumann, or what did you say? So this is a physical computer. This is morphological computation, where you exploit the material dynamics of the system to perform computation. I think we're getting there. Now, just for the fun of it, Barry Trimmer at Tufts University builds soft robots, and I'm almost done. I'm almost done. Builds soft robots, and you, like here, you can see one. This is with SMA's shape memory alloys, kind of actually. It's not very exciting, but look at the lower right corner. You have to look now because it's very fast. Caterpillars. So this is a caterpillar robot. They can roll up into like a tire-like structure, and then they're very fast in their movement. Oops, what happened? Okay. Yeah, if you look at the right lower corner, one, and that's real time. This is the slow motion, so that you can see a bit better what's actually happening. Very, very fast. Okay, now the last example that I want to give you of the power of materials is the Jaeger-Lipson coffee balloon gripper. Now, if you go to the supermarket and you buy a pack of ground coffee, then it's typically hard like a rock because of the vacuum, right? Now you go home, you open it, it gets really soft. So what they did is they took a balloon, filled it with finely ground coffee, and then they applied a vacuum pump to the balloon, and then they just go over the object with the balloon. Because of its softness, the balloon automatically, without control, adapts to the shape of the object. And then they apply the vacuum, the structure hardens but doesn't change shape, And then with the same control, exactly the same control, they can grasp objects with any kind of shape. That's really exploiting. Here is just a few, like a light bulb, just a few objects that you can see. You know, I think it's an extremely ingenious kind of. And here's something much heavier. But you know, the gripper doesn't care. You know, it's just the same control. It's the passive adaptation that we use, and the benchmark is of course the raw egg. Well, sure enough. And this is just to demonstrate that it is indeed a raw egg playing, and you can see the stuff coming out. Okay, now, okay, this soft robotics, I think, has many application areas. Among others, this robot companion for citizen, you know, the flagship. Let me just flip through this, and let me just talk very briefly about implications. If you look at food handling, you know, that Swiss favorite, I'm Swiss, right? So the Swiss favorite is chocolate. Now look at the variation of shapes that you have with the chocolates. You know, it's an enormous variation. So if you want to handle chocolate, then you need to think differently about the problem, right? And also, I mean, this is slightly less challenging, but also challenging now. It's a big problem in the food industry. Now, remember what we had before. On the left, high predictability, high programmability. On the right, low predictability. Now, this high predictability with this variation of shapes is shrinking. So we need to also in the manufacturing domain go towards adaptive systems. Now, this is, you can't see the whole picture. So this is a factory of Foxconn in China. So Foxconn is producing the iPad and the iPhone in China with manual labor. Now, what is it about these manipulation tasks that is really hard? It's maybe, you know, the sensing in the fingertips, you know, which is extremely challenging. We have very many sensors. It's soft, deformable. Maybe this is one of the key points, maybe not the only one. I think with soft robotics, we will be able to automate these kinds of tasks and re-insource some of these tasks, like Rodney Brooks with his company Rethink Robotics. And he just, I think about 2 months ago, they announced this Baxter robot, which is, he says, modest as he is, this is going to be the beginning of the next industrial revolution. What's interesting is there's no programming, so people who don't know anything anything about computers can use them. It's learning by demonstration. It's very flexible and affordable, and it has a certain common sense. That is, it can, for example, recognize when something goes wrong in the environment and switch off. And with this, probably some of the manufacturing tasks can be re-insourced. Okay, let me now conclude. So what we would like, this is what we would like to have, what we had at the beginning. And we said soft robotics might actually be an option here. And here is just a reminder of the 4 messages. The physical embedding, you know, looking at the control program, producing the control is not enough. We need to understand the distinctions between real and artificial worlds. There's a task distribution, and we have physical dynamics in the information structure. The fact that through our own interaction with the environment, we induce correlations, patterns of sensory stimulation and correlations. Soft robotics, the central role of materials, this sort of lack of separation, or the sort of separation doesn't hold anymore. We need a new notion of control. We need to understand the design space that you have here. We looked at the import for manufacturing. If you would like to know more, visit us in Zurich, or we're going to have a big exhibition in March next year in Zurich, where we will have the factory robot Baxter, the beginning of the next industrial revolution. Also, Andy Arena and his team will come to Zurich and try a new world record, so that the Cornell Ranger will be able to walk maybe 150 kilometers rather than only 65. Or you can read this book, How the Body Shapes the Way You Think, in Chinese, Japanese, a short version, or you can read it in French or in Arabic. Or you can join the Shanghai lectures, which was actually this morning. I was in Carlos III, and we broadcast the Shanghai lectures from there here, Carlos III. And we started that in 2009. Now these are the universities from all over the world participating. I would like to acknowledge my collaborators, the funding agency, and thank you for your attentions.
Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I was please, I would ask you to sit down here together with Julián Merelo from the University in Granada, so we can have a little discussion together around the topics we have been talking about this morning. Thank you very much. So vamos a seguir directamente ahora mismo con la mesa redonda. Por favor, Juan Julián Merelo de la Universidad de Granada va a moderar la mesa en la cual van a participar Gusz Eiben y Rolf Pfeifer para profundizar y comentar los temas que se han expuesto esta mañana. En esta mesa redonda espero, confío, contar con vuestra colaboración y vuestra intervención con preguntas y comentarios relacionados con ambas conferencias de esta mañana. Muchas gracias.
That's perfect. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Hola. Ok. Yo creo que lo que vamos a hacer primero, ya que no ha habido tiempo para hacerles preguntas a los dos conferenciantes, es daros un poco de tiempo para que vosotros hagáis cualquier pregunta. ¿De acuerdo? Luego, bueno, yo le haré una serie de preguntas. Todas las preguntas también las tenéis en Twitter. Las he puesto en mi Twitter. Están con el hashtag Seminario Vida. Si queréis aportar más preguntas y lo queréis hacer un poco calladito. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is now. Can you hear me now? I can hear myself.
No, they don't have the signal at the group.
Okay.
Jane, can you test it now?
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Should I sing?
Okay, yes.
This music? Okay. So, okay. Lo que decía era que si queréis hacer preguntas, simplemente utilizar el hashtag de este sitio, Seminario Vida. Yo también me presento, soy Juan Julián Merelo, trabajo en la Universidad de Granada y bueno, simplemente voy a ser el moderador. Lo que voy a tratar también es que tanto Gusz Eiben como Rolf Pfeifer sean breves en sus intervenciones porque, bueno, tenemos aproximadamente 70 minutos, así que lo que les pediría sería que en sus respuestas fueran lo más breves posible, no mucho más de 5 minutos. ¿That's okay? No more than 5 minutes per question? Okay, so, please. Ahora tenéis vosotros la palabra. Si queréis hacer alguna pregunta, pues adelante. No questions? Okay, so I'll ask my own questions. I'll do it in English if you don't mind. Is that okay for you? Okay, so my first question is, I wouldn't say embarrassed, but I was quite surprised that you didn't mention open source even a single moment in your talk. So do you think that really if we are going to create new ways of creating robots, if we are going to create new ways of life, it's going to have nothing to do with open source. Are they going to be open source? Are they going to be closed source? What's going to happen with that? So this question is for you, for both.
The robot that I was mentioning, also tendon-driven, the successor of this robot Etche called Roboy, that's completely open source. So, and also
it has to be, since you are asking for crowdfunding, it has to be. I mean,
well, the crowdfunding, that's one thing, but the other thing is that all the schematics, all the designs, and also we let people participate in the designs if they have suggestions. So I think it has to be open source. So at the end, anybody will be able to get the CAD drawings, and basically reproduce the entire robot. So I think that's also a requirement that often comes from the European Union, which I think makes a lot of sense.
In my perception of the ideas in my talk, they make the question of you completely inappropriate or inadequate, because software is not developed by humans who may decide to disclose it or not. Software is emerging by evolution. So the open source distinction is only appropriate in cases where humans make the software and may keep it for themselves. But it will emerge and evolve on these devices, on these embodied things, and then it will be there for analysis and inspection for everybody.
Okay, that's a very good answer. Do you have any other questions related to this one? ¿Tenía alguna pregunta relacionada con esto? So I'll proceed to the next one. I was quite surprised about artificial intelligence and artificial life. I think it's science with a point and a bit of hubris on the side. So with artificial life, what you are saying is, okay, I am saying that life can be made, it can be evolved. So you really have a point when doing that kind of science. On the other hand, engineering, basically what you are saying is, just check this out, this is working. So do you really think that the philosophical or ethical or let's say epistemological side of science is important when you are initiating new research or when you are trying to change completely the game, or your basic motivation is just doing something that works?
There's a politically correct answer to that, but the honest answer is it's more curiosity. So I'm a representative of the curiosity-driven research, and I'm aware of the ethical dimensions of it. And that's why I was emphasizing the importance of the kill switch. But as for me, I would like to understand, for instance, life and evolution, and then I would like to have a sandbox to play around with, as biologists may not be able, ethically allowed to do anything and everything for quite a long period. In this would-be science that I was sketching would be able, until somebody will postulate or hypothesize that all these beings are also subject to ethics. But until that point, we can have lots of curiosity-driven research and try to understand the world and the mechanics and the patterns that created us. Basically, that's my motivation.
Yeah, I think
you care.
Yeah, I think we of course are curious. We want to try things, see if it works, and basically if we don't do it, someone else will do it. But I think it's important. If I look, for example, at this flagship, the robot companion for citizens, their ethics has a very big part in it, and not only ethics. It's not only a scientific committee, but it's really a part where the population at large will be involved in discussing the issues, of desirability, of potential dangers, of potential utility, and so on. So I think we want to try, we want to go ahead. We don't want to constrain ourselves unnecessarily, but we really want the open discussion.
Okay, another question is, basically, artificial life wants to create life from scratch. They want to see life as it is in the context of life as it could be. The basic idea is creating life from the ground up. But on the other hand, what I'm seeing that you are doing, for instance, is more on the side of inspiration from nature, or not only from life, but also from physics in general. So, what's the way to go? Do you think that you should pick and choose what you are interested in engineering, or start from scratch and say, okay, what I'm going to do is just to create something that's lifelike, self-reproduces, is autonomous, and so forth, and see what happens?
Well, I think it depends very much on your goals. I think you just mentioned, there are basically two orientations. One is you're just curious and try to see what happens. Can we recreate with artificial systems, lifelike systems? And then sort of what might actually happen is that if you do that, you discover things that you would not have discovered had you gone with a sort of more goal-directed approach, saying, I would like to develop a technical system for this particular purpose. So I think this exploration phase and trying to maybe just reproduce natural phenomena, I think it will never be exactly natural phenomena, and I think there's a lot of surprise. When we saw for the first time these block pushers, that came as a big surprise that actually worked. And we didn't tell these creatures how big they had to be, how they had to move, how they had to push things, but that basically...
It's very similar, if you don't mind my saying, to what Carl Sims did, 15 years ago. Do you remember that Carl Sims simulations? They were also created with blocks. No, they weren't developed, but they were like a block creatures that actually evolved a way of working and moving stuff. And well, I think it was in Alive '96 maybe something. Carl Sims, remember that?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Of course.
So it's I kind of remember that kind of work from what you just showed there. The basic difference is that
very surprising, very surprising results, know. And I think that's the kind of thing that I would also be looking for when I work with people from artificial life. These kinds of surprises. Oh wow, this can be done. I didn't realize this could be done.
And going into one aspect of your question is whether or not we are bound to natural ideas or natural mechanisms. No, that's one big difference here. As long as the technology makes it possible, we are free to do it any way we wish or any way we can. Remember my multi-parent crossover operators with 3 parents or more. We can do it, and nothing. We don't have that many limitations. So I guess we should benefit from this liberty and flexibility.
Yes, and also as an engineer, I mean, we want to use steel, which is one of the best materials for construction. Nature doesn't use steel. Mm-hmm. Also, we want to use GPS for navigation. Nature hasn't evolved GPS. Mm-hmm. So we can go beyond nature by exploiting our technology.
And very curious, you just mentioned artificial life people. So you don't consider yourself, even if you're using in your robotics design lots of artificial life elements, you don't consider yourself an artificial life person? I mean, you don't consider you are doing anything related to artificial life? So it's like artificial life is there, I'm here.
Of course, what you consider to be artificial life is relatively arbitrary. I mean, the community, let's say, and you could say, well, building robots, that's a kind of life form. I view it as a kind of life form, so I think I at least marginally fit into the artificial life community. Also in terms of methods, I mean, we use a lot of evolutionary methods, which, at least partially have their origin in the artificial life community. We're very interested in emergence and self-organization, and we can learn a lot from the artificial life community. So I think in that sense, we are really part of the artificial life community. But let's say, if people look at it from the outside, they work largely in simulation. I mean, most artificial life people, and we insist that we need to build real world physical systems. If you take, for example, the tribalons, the emergent bicycle, with the triangle and the green discs, I would have liked to get the simulator that would have given me this result, right? That didn't exist. Now, of course, that we understand how it's going, we can build that into the simulator, but we are always in for a surprise if we build the real world systems, and that, I think, maybe distinguishes us at least from a large part of the artificial life community.
But what's the big deal with the physical world? I mean, you really have libraries, physics libraries, that are incredibly accurate. So still you say, and
Well,
Gusz has mentioned it too, that when you change, go from a simulation to a real life, it completely changes. Of course, it should, but why? I mean, you have simulators that are as close as possible to reality, and even better than reality.
How can it be better than reality?
Reality sucks.
No, I think
If you look closely, you can see the pixels.
the way I put it was matter matters. It really changes the whole game. So this is my motivation going to real life. You know, you can study evolutionary processes in a fully digital environment, and it's hugely exciting, but limited somehow. And you will get much greater challenges and much nicer surprises once you get over the boundary and get into physical.
But I remember there was a plenary talk by Marvin Minsky. I think it was in Alive 95, probably. I was in Japan. And he said that he hated people doing robotics because they spend an inordinate amount of time with, doing with cogs and doing things with, with the physical stuff instead of doing real artificial intelligence, or instead of going really deeply into the roots of that. I don't know if you've heard about that talk. It was quite...
Well, you know, many people say that. Many people say it's a waste of time to build robots. But ultimately, I mean, we're not only interested in understanding the principles, we also want to build stuff. We want useful stuff in the real world. And if you just do the simulation, you will never get useful stuff in the real world.
Okay. Have something to add? So you agree with that?
I fully agree with Rolf.
So since you insist in building physical stuff, probably you have heard about the uncanny valley, right?
Huh?
The uncanny valley. When people are building robots, okay, when they get more and more lifelike, when they get more and more like humans, it comes to a certain point, instead of thinking they are cuddly and they are beautiful and they're cute, they project they are rejected by people. It's called the uncanny valley. So I think that the picture you showed of this little kid looking at the robot, like saying, "Oh my God," what's this? Reflected, mirror in a way that uncanny valley. So I was seeing this little kid in the uncanny valley. So it's actually a purely sociological or psychological issue. But do you think that that's really a design problem, or it's something that will change with time as people get more used to seeing this kind of robots?
Well,
you can answer that too if you want afterwards.
Go ahead.
It's mainly for Rolf.
So there are many studies that show that people feel comfortable interacting with robots. Children as well as adults feel comfortable interacting with robots as long as they can clearly distinguish and say, it's a robot, it's a machine, basically. If it gets too much, like, too close, doesn't even have to be very close, but if it gets closer to humans, and looks at, you really get the impression they look at you, and so then people start feeling uncomfortable. So I think it's a design issue, and at least for the time being, if I wanted to sell a robot, or I wanted to convince people that it's a good idea to interact with robots, I would design them in a way that it's clearly visible that it's a machine.
The robots taking over the world, yes, that's an old idea indeed. Once again, this kill switch thing, it's really essential. So don't start a process which you cannot stop. And one dimension I didn't mention is the legal dimension. There will be huge challenges for lawyers. Imagine a robot that is adaptive. And then when you buy a car now, you have guarantees for its behavior. If you push gas, it will accelerate. If you push the brake, it will decelerate. That's it. And if it doesn't do it, then the manufacturer pays you. But what if you have an adaptive device which is evolving in your possession by you using it, and it starts doing something you don't want? Whose fault is it? Is it the manufacturer? Or is it you who were training it already for a year?
Or is it the robot itself?
Is it the robot itself, or is it the guy who designed the evolutionary mechanism that made the robot change behavior? So I guess before it really gets out in the wild, these issues will be fixed. I hope so. Must be fixed, otherwise they won't get out in the wild. And I can't imagine any other way that there will be always an ultimate kill switch somehow, somewhere. We will be able to switch them off.
Yeah, not to mention the issue of rights of a particular creature. There was a short story published, I think 2 or 3 months ago in Asimov's magazine, in which a companion robot, like the one you just mentioned, was abused by his owner, and eventually this robot or creature or whatever developed some kind of self-conscience and killed his abuser, his owner. So then there was a matter of what can you do with it? You just erase it, but if it was able to kill his abuser, it has some kind of self-conscience. So maybe it should have some rights. Probably you can think that there's a quantum leap from here to there, but I think that we are very much approaching the level in which we should start to think about this kind of legal issues, about whether a little bit of self-consciousness implies some kind of rights, about what we can call or not self-consciousness, what will happen when that... Okay, yes.
I think ultimately this may be the case. But if we look, I think we always have to be careful that we don't underestimate what robots can do today, but that we don't overestimate them. So I think it's a matter of finding the right balance. Now there is a famous statement, a famous quotation by David McFarland, a famous ethologist from Oxford. And he said, anthropomorphization, the incurable disease. So basically, humans have a very strong tendency to attribute their own feelings and ideas and goals into the environment. Now, if this environment happens to be a robot, doesn't even need to be a robot, but if it's a robot, then even more so do we have the tendency, the very strong compulsion to attribute our own feelings to the robot. The robot's looking at it, then we say, oh, it's looking at us. But looking, what's looking? I mean, looking, there's an intention, we recognize maybe another person, we recognize a danger or whatever, and we use anthropomorphic vocabulary to describe the behavior of the robots. I think we have to be very careful that we don't use anthropomorphic vocabulary, but that we clearly realize, what these robots can do, and that they're machines and they're programmed in particular ways. Maybe they have a neural network that can learn a bit, but there's absolutely no comparison. I mean, let me just give you one example. For psychologists, developmental psychologists and developmental neuroscientists tell us that the haptic modality, the touch modality is very important for concept development and for the development of our thinking in general and for our mastery of the environment. Now we have if you look at the fingertip, we have several hundred touch, temperature, vibration and pain sensors per fingertip. And that gives us extremely rich information about the environment. Now, if I look at and this is very important to develop concepts in the real world, the touch modality is probably equally, if not more important than the visual one. Without the visual modality, people can live very well, but without the haptic modality, it's probably impossible. So that's very, very important. Now, what we have in robots is typically, if you have a lot, then we have maybe 16 touch sensors, and the tissue is not deformable, and you can sort of hardly read it out in parallel. It breaks, it's not robust. And so if we compare that haptic ability to the haptic ability of humans, it's almost ridiculous. So I think we have to see where we stand at this point. And now, to what extent the haptic modality, the ability to feel with the haptic modality is really important for something like, self-awareness or consciousness, I don't know. But I would assume it's very important, and we're very far from actually being there.
Excuse me, Rolf, isn't that another stance of there will be 3 or 4 computers in the whole wide world?
Huh?
You're saying that the haptic ability of robots is nothing like the haptic ability of humans right now?
At this point, yes. I mean, of course, a little bit. They can sense touch, but they don't have the richness that we have.
I was talking about science fiction, and science fiction is a projection into the future.
Okay.
Okay, we could be talking about 5 years from now, maybe or 10 years from now, maybe 20 years from now, maybe about some technology that we still don't know. I mean, there are some technologies that we still don't know. I'm pretty sure about that. So there is nothing fundamentally different between humans and machines.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. Yes.
Please, Karin.
My question is, aren't humans losing? Sorry, thank you. My question right now is concerning the haptical abilities. Aren't humans losing right now these abilities because they are too much related to just the technical and virtual relationship concerning our realities? Because we right now we have a young generation of persons who are mainly using computers, iPads, and technical elements which doesn't allow to develop very much our haptical cognition. What do you think about this? Do we lose these abilities due to the technical use of tools we use to be related to our reality and to our surrounding? What about that?
I think evolutionarily speaking, we are not losing anything. On an evolutionary time scale, this is nothing. So a couple of generations is really not sufficiently long to lose any or gain any ability.
You're saying
we are not selected for or against. I don't think, evolutionarily speaking, this is an irrelevant issue.
So texting very quickly doesn't contribute to your fitness, actually, right?
Sorry?
Texting very quickly doesn't contribute to your fitness.
No, not that I know. No, it doesn't increase or decrease the number of your children.
I think it's a very interesting question. If you look at ontogenetic development, then it's really, and the psychologists tell us, developmental psychologists, that the interaction or the different sensory modalities are extremely important in developing, our concepts. So if the haptic modality is not stimulated, as it used to be, I think the result will be that our concepts will be different that we actually form, because our sensory, ultimately our concepts are all grounded in the sensory motor interactions with the environment, so that the concepts that we form will actually be different. I'm convinced of that. To what extent that has a detrimental influence on, for example, the cognitive or the emotional development of humans, I wouldn't know of any studies that have systematically investigated that, but I think it's an extremely interesting question. I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, this may not be so relevant, but we live here and now. We don't live in 100 generations later, and so it would be very interesting to see, well, what is it that our children can do or can no longer do because they suffer from a deprivation of this kind of sensory stimulation?
One thing I noticed that my children can do and that I cannot do is processing massively multi-channel information flows. Like my daughter would watch TV, MTV, which is already split screen anyway, and the running text. And then she is, doing a game on the iPad, and then meanwhile she's texting on her iPhone. And then also doing a conversation with mother in the other side of the room. And it's just too much for me. It's not haptic, it's it's a multi-channel information processing that, as you said, children can do, we can do. So most likely the next generation will be much better in this because they are doing it already from a very young age.
Right.
But once again,
there may be things that they can't do as well as we can, because of this change.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
How relevant that is going to be, we don't know.
Buenas tardes. Me llamo Francisco Hernández. Soy profesor de arte, por lo cual esto Quiero decir que mi desconocimiento de muchas facetas técnicas reconozco que es absoluto. Está muy interesado en la faceta de arte y vida artificial. Y en la conferencia del profesor Pfeifer me ha interesado mucho, desconocía la vertiente del soft o de la soft robótica, y me ha recordado el encuentro que tuvieron en París Le Corbusier y Salvador Dalí. Entonces el arquitecto le preguntó al pintor catalán, maestro, ¿usted cómo piensa que tiene que ser la arquitectura moderna? Y Dalí le respondió rápidamente, blanda. En alusión a la defensa precisamente de la arquitectura de Gaudí, frente a, perdón, que lo signifique, la robótica de brazo rígido, la robótica de la precisión, de la fabricación de maquinaria, la evolución que hace Honda de esa robótica hasta la excelencia, pero una vía distinta, muy distinta de la otra que ha estado presentando y que me ha parecido realmente fascinante. Gaudí renuncia al ángulo recto porque dice que en la naturaleza el ángulo recto no existe y desarrolla toda una arquitectura con unos materiales y con una inspiración muy distinta. Entonces, me ha sorprendido mucho esa inspiración en la naturaleza de algo tan mecánico o tan preciso como la robótica. Y bien, me gustaría que si fuera posible, nos diera unas líneas o insistiera un poquito más en ese futuro de la inspiración en la naturaleza o en lo blando de la robótica, ¿no?
Okay, I think we're continuously, if we work like that, we're continuously surprised. You know, the more we're trying to sort of approximate nature, the more we're trying to learn from nature, the more we're fascinated, you know, by how well it's actually engineered. You know, which doesn't mean that in some cases we cannot go beyond. But let me just give you a couple of examples. One example is the skin that I already mentioned. You know, I mean, not only does it have many sensors, it's robust, it's passively deformable, and if it breaks, if it is damaged, it regrows. Now, I mean, if we can have materials that repair themselves, that will be an enormous technological progress. And there we can learn a lot from nature. You know, having growing systems, we can learn from nature. I think if you have growing systems, they're automatically going to be more adaptive. I think we also discussed this concept, by the way, with architects. They said, well, if we had, you know, if we could grow our, you know, constructions rather than designing them and then just putting them there, then, you know, we might come up with completely different designs that we haven't thought about. So I think there are really many, many connections, and we can continue to be surprised.
Bueno, si me permites que añada algo, lo cierto es que Gaudí usaba computadores analógicos para hacer su cálculo de estructuras. Lo que utilizaba eran telas impregnadas en yeso, entonces la colgaba en sillas para poder hacer los cálculos estructurales. Es decir, que realmente hacía lo que menciona el profesor Pfeifer, utilizar la propia estructura como computadora y utilizar la propia memoria y la propia... o sea, la propia, digamos...
That's morphological computation.
Sí, la propia computación morfológica. No sé si es una leyenda, lo estoy buscando en internet, pero no va demasiado bien, pero creo que era efectivamente así. No sé si tienes más información sobre ese tema, o lo sabía.
Sí, sé que hay una exposición ambulante que Gaudí prescinde del sistema tradicional de proyectar, de manera que un arquitecto es responsable de lo que dibuja en un plano, pero que reproduce otro, porque hay un lenguaje normativo que universalmente aceptado, de manera que lo que está en el plano se puede llevar a la realidad. Gaudí prescinde de eso y efectivamente proyecta a base de saquitos de arena o de escayola colgados de cadenas, y lo que hace es invertir el arco. Bueno, lo que usa como base de su proyecto es la catenaria. y mediante esas estructuras colgantes pues va diseñando los proyectos. Evidentemente, en una cadena colgada con un peso es imposible que haya un ángulo recto, con lo cual toda la estructura de su arquitectura está basada en esas maquetas colgantes fascinantes que han reproducido en varias escuelas de arquitectura.
Muchísimas gracias. You want to say something, Marcus? Al final.
I was quite impressed by the research line on exploiting the materiality, the self-organizing capacities of the material interactions with environment and so on. Now, trying to deep a little bit more in this direction, my question is related with an aspect which is the aspect which relates with the constraints of science and time. And I am asking this question because since all biological systems are based in metabolism and therefore in a molecular chemical organization, sensory motor devices are basically from the beginning at devices at the molecular size or at molecular machines. And so my question is if there is any research in this direction in artificial life, trying to build kind of robots, sensory motor robots or motors or devices that are trying to do tasks, sensory motor tasks, but at molecular level, as molecular machines.
Yeah, I mean there are a lot of, there's a whole field called Nano Robotics, and there it's amazing, you know, what they can already do at the molecular level. For example, there are already robots, sort of micro or nanometer sized robots that can actually be put into people's retinas to perform manipulation tasks and to repair damages in people's retinas. There are also already prototypes available which were actually developed at ETH in Zurich, where they use these devices in eyes of pigs, for example, you know, which have a certain similarity to eyes of humans. But yes, very much so. I think it's a very active and a very promising research field with very, let's say, promising potential in the medical area.
One thing your question made me think of is not really changing the metabolism of robots, but rather changing the way they gain energy. I saw an experimental setup in Bristol. A robot was eating flies, and it was really like digesting meat to get energy, which is a completely different way than recharging your iPhone on a power outlet.
Hola, buenos días. Voy a preguntarlo directamente en inglés. So I was very impressed by the matter matters question because it's a philosophical question that is therefore relevant to art. So I'm happy that art questions are coming up now already, although the two people we have heard right now are technicians, right? But the very interesting point that you made, I think, was about anthropomorphism, and which is inducing also the question of anthropocentrism. And this brain centrality is something that was already very much discussed in the 70s, and I want to quote here and ask you whether there have been a kind of influence of the studies, for example, of the ecological approach to cognitive psychology, such as articulated by James G. Gibson or others, which have...
Turvey, yes, Turvey.
Yeah, and there's something, when working with soft materials, you also delegate decision-making to processes that are material and that not are basically cognitive-based. So there's a switch from the cognitive brain-centered vision of not only anthropomorphism but anthropocentrism as such, which is a philosophical question, and that the matter-matter questions become also a questioning of reframing the human within a kind of material environment. So I wanted to ask in how far this kind of philosophical questions that, as we are going to see, I think, in the next presentations and at least tomorrow, in how far these questions are relevant to artists. not only to work in a way to say the function of art is to apply and to invent new functions, but maybe to questions and the function of art being its dysfunctionality as such, which is embedded. So maybe some of the artists will challenge exactly this anthropocentrism that you are challenging through the rematerialization.
Well, I don't have an answer to the real specific question, but it made me think of some things like artists and their matters. The question I will answer now is like, how far can the artist really go to the matter and go away from the humans? So one direction from evolutionary art is using evolutionary processes without a human in the loop. Typically, as I said, the human is a fitness function, and they try to get around this bottleneck, and it's a bottleneck because of fatigue and etc., by using so-called aesthetic measures. And an aesthetic measure is something which is objective, it's quantitative, it's measurable, and then it should decide whether something is better or worse according to these aesthetics. And the big, huge vision, which is maybe very far-fetched, I relate this in my mind, and my PhD student who is doing it didn't want to get this vision first, but to the periodic system. We have the periodic system, which consists of a couple of atoms. These are really elementary things, but based on these atoms, we can make very complex molecules. And these aesthetic measures, the evolutionary artists are trying to discover and put at use, they might be the atoms of aesthetics. And we might end up with 92 of these aesthetic measures, which enable us to put together any taste, just like we are able to put together any molecule. And while making the Mondrian revolver was easy, making the Escher revolver was a bit harder, but not that challenging. You know, having a Botticelli revolver would be completely beyond the possibilities. But once this program would succeed, we could have the atomic descriptors of our human tastes, and then we could go into the material, human-less evolution of art. Far-fetched, I know.
Well, not being an artist, I can't really say how useful this would be for artists, but what I can say is that the sorts of things that we're doing, with the adaptive materials and that stuff, and, changing stiffness of muscles dynamically, which takes over control functions and outsources, whatever you want to call this computation tool, physical components, raises fundamental philosophical issues. And we do discuss these issues, and one prominent individual that is very interested in these kinds of ideas is Dan Dennett. And we were also running a seminar for a long time together. I was running a seminar with a philosopher, and initially when we started this, I said, well, I'm happy to do this, but I don't know anything about philosophy. And then he said, well, what you are doing is philosophy. And I think in some sense, it is philosophy.
Buenos días. Mi pregunta también va un poco girando alrededor del mundo del arte electrónico, del arte y la robótica. En distintos eventos de arte electrónico, como por ejemplo Ars Electrónica o Art Futura, ha habido presentaciones de robots antropocéntricos o geminoides también, por ejemplo, que han tenido muy buena acogida por parte del público, que han interactuado de manera muy satisfactoria con estos robots antropocéntricos. El caso, por ejemplo, de Telenoid, de Hiroshi Iseguro en Ars Electrónica, donde tenía un robot, un robot de aspecto antropocéntrico, hacía de mediador entre la comunicación de dos seres humanos, de tal manera que el robot copiaba la gestualidad, los gestos de una persona, y a través de ese robot se comunicaba con otra persona. Y bueno, esto también a nivel de comunicación, de cómo es la comunicación humana, los robots antropocéntricos pues pueden también ayudarnos a entender, y en ese sentido, por ejemplo, Jules, el robot que diseñó David Byrne, el cantante de los Talking Heads, con la empresa Hanson Robotics, se presentó en Art Futura, y ahí causó también una gran impresión. Este robot cantaba y la gente pues se reunía a su alrededor y lo que expresó David Baer sobre esto era que había también un momento o aspectos en que los espectadores estaban un poco incómodos ante ese robot. Eso también sucedía, ¿no? Pero que era muy importante porque nos hacía este tipo de experiencias preguntarnos y aprender sobre la percepción humana o sobre cómo nos comunicamos. Y en ese sentido, pues quería preguntarles si conocían este tipo de experiencias, lo que llaman algunos expertos en robótica el valle inexplicable, o Peter Planktek, por ejemplo, que no se que es un problema de diseño realmente, o si hay algo más, y si están trabajando con artistas o van a trabajar con artistas en este campo, porque los artistas llevan ya pues 10, 15 años, quizás más años, trabajando precisamente en todo esto.
Yeah. Okay, I'm very much aware of this. So Hiroshi Ishiguro is an old friend of mine, and we discuss these things. He will also be coming to this exhibition in March and presenting his Android robot, so people can interact with it. You call it anthropocentric. I'm not really sure about the term anthropocentric. I mean, the androids, they're not autonomous, they're remote controlled. So basically the goal there is not to produce an autonomous robot, but the goal is to produce, just this resemblance. And I think you're making a very interesting point, that also Hiroshi is making. He's saying, well, by building a copy of himself, or he wants to learn about himself. And so I think building sort of very robots that resemble very, very closely human beings can maybe be exploited or can be used so that we can learn more about our own nature, how we are and how we interact. And so I think they're really fascinating kinds of experiments that can be made in this way. Now, I don't know very much about systematic studies. I mean, most of the information that I have is anecdotal, just as you were presenting. These are anecdotes, they're not systematic studies, but there is something to it. People are emotionally touched by such experiences, which makes, maybe we feel uneasy or maybe we feel comfortable, but these are emotional experiences. But I don't know, I'm not aware of any systematic studies in this area, but it's definitely fascinating.
Sí, yo tenía una pregunta más relacionada quizá con la forma o con cómo están evolucionando los robots, y quizá es más para la segunda conferencia. Estaba pensando también cuando la invención del movimiento, uno de los primeros, creo que empezaron morfológicamente a ver cómo podían tratarlo y nunca se pareció a una pierna, ¿no? Es más parecido a una rueda que en cierta manera no tiene nada ni de antropomorfismo ni de biomorfismo. También estaba viendo los últimos robots que habéis presentado, que era la figura que estaba en la pista de atletismo, que casi estaban más relacionados con la física simple o con las máquinas simples, como la palanca, como el tornillo. Entonces, casi más parecía unas tijeras, ¿no? Entonces, la evolución estaba viendo si iba más a que se parecieran al objeto al cual tratas de imitar, o es más, tiene más peso otro tipo de funciones más relacionadas quizá con la física clásica o otros sistemas. Y luego sí, el peso del material, ¿no? Eso sí, yo creo que tiene mayor constancia, es decir, la importancia que tiene el tipo de material que estás utilizando. Eso es lo primero. Y luego otra segunda pregunta, sin más relacionada, si siempre la robótica está en torno a objetos, o quizá hay un análisis también de cómo se robotizan también esos ambientes, o esos environment, ¿no? Esa manera de cambiar o darle dinámica no solo al objeto, sino donde lo introduces.
Okay, let me start with the second question. The environments. I think whenever we design systems for any purpose, we have to keep the environment in mind. And often, by a simple modification of the environment, we can reduce the complexity of the design of the system by orders of magnitude. but just putting some stuff in the environment. And by letting the robot exploit the environment, and we do that, humans do that on a continuous basis. We don't represent everything, we don't, you know, so we just, for example, follow, you know, people say when they explain where you should go, you just follow here, you know, in this direction until you get there. So basically you just follow, very simple. The environment already has a structure that you can exploit. You can put a little bit of additional structure in the environment. You can put some satellites in the sky, and then you can navigate in on the entire planet. So yes, very much so, and I think roboticists should think more about the environments when they actually design their systems. That's very much so. Now the first question, I'm not 100% sure I understood what the real question. Could you perhaps briefly restate what you had in mind?
La importancia de que las cosas se parezcan a lo que tratas en cierta manera de emular. Si el movimiento, cuando tiene que parecerse al ser humano o a un pulpo, en el caso del octopus, y yo creo que en los últimos que estaban enseñando se parecían más a una máquina simple, a unas tijeras, que no tienen nada que ver. No sé si es que cuando lo saques al mercado, no sé si hay demanda de un robot que no se parezca para nada a un ser humano o a una rana o a un pez.
Yeah, okay, I think now I understand. So what is the basically I think the question is about the goals. So what are the goals? Now we have, I think it relates to an earlier question that we had, you know, what are your goals? Do we want to mimic the biological system? And, you know, if I take the slogan understanding by building, then if we want to mimic the biological system, we typically have the goal in mind to understand the biological system, to gain a better understanding. Now, having said that, often it turns out that when you're building such a system, you're developing a technology that turns out to be extremely useful and can be used for concrete applications. Now, the other thing is we can just say, well, and that's what, for example, people in manufacturing do. They say, well, if I want to assemble something, you know, in a factory floor, there's absolutely no need to have an anthropomorphic design, because there may be ways in which you can do it much faster and much easier and much cheaper than, you know, take for example, when we have a screw, we want to drive a screw into something, we take a screwdriver, and so we put it in there, we turn, then we take it out again, put it in there, turn, take it out again, and you know, we slip away, and it's about the worst possible way in which you can do it. So often humans do these tasks in very stupid ways. And, you know, having just a motor that rotates 360 degrees is the much better solution to drive a screw. So often when we have the goal of just achieving a particular task, it's silly to look at how humans do this.
Yes, and I would distinguish two things here. One is whether it follows biology, so it is biologically inspired, and another thing is whether it's biologically plausible. And as Rolf just said, it doesn't need to be either of them, because, you know, something rotating 360 degrees is not biologically plausible, but still we do it, no problems.
Good morning. I think I can question in English. As we have seen, the process of evolution is we can stop, and I think that robots can help us to improve our lives. But do you think we should establish some limits to avoid going into a world like the described world in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World? If yes, what limits would you think that would be okay and which not?
Well, I think if Aldous Huxley were alive today, he would be scared to death, you know, because we have gone already much beyond what he was predicting as, you know, the most horrible vision that we can possibly think of. So I think we get, I think limiting us at this point, you know, saying, okay, we don't want to go beyond that point would be a big mistake. I think we have to go along, we have to make progress, and then, but continuously, you know, think about, well, do we really want this? Do we want this? And then maybe over time you say, you know, if we, for example, if we look at how dependent we are on our technology, take the mobile phone. Take the mobile phone away from a teenager, you know. She will freak out, she will, after 2 days, she will be ready for psychiatric treatment. Now, so there is an extreme dependency on the technology. If someone had, you know, sort of said 50 years ago, we have to be careful that we don't, you know, really depend so much on technology, and would have stopped all the developments, it would have been stupid, couldn't have been stopped anyhow. So I don't think, you know, it would have taken place anyhow, you know, with the regulations, so people just go around the regulations. I think we have to, you know, go on with the development, but continuously think about desirability, you know, about impacts, about legal issues, about ethical issues. But I don't think we should sort of limit us at this point. I think a good example is like gene technology or, you know, stem cell research. I think we had to sort of first see what can be done, you know, with stem cells, and now we can start thinking about how we want to regulate the research with stem cells. If we never had researched into stem cells, we wouldn't know what the good regulations would be.
Yes, I fully agree. And somehow this is a lost battle already. I mean, we are moving towards a world which is, there are lots of descriptions. One is, which is populated by artificial devices, just as like by humans. These cell phones are not so intelligent. They don't have many actuators, but you know, in 10 years, 20 years from now, a large part of the actors around us will have actuators, will be physically visible. It's just going to happen. So the question is not whether we should do that, but as you just said, how do we constrain it and how do we contain it?
If I may follow up a little bit on the answer, I think the issue is whether we can actually physically do that. I think there is as far as I know, there is a single case in which a scientific community has self-regulated, and that was the case of genetic manipulation of embryos. So the whole scientific community got together and say, okay, no, we are not going there. But of course, you can't be sure that they are not doing it in North Korea or somewhere in Siberia or you know, in Cyprus, in North Cyprus or whatever. So the thing is, okay, can the robotic community come to a particular red line and say, okay, we are not, never, ever going to do that because it's going to put in danger the very self-nature of the human being or very survivability. Probably some people would say, okay, we can do it. As when we arrive to that beach, we will see what we do. But I'm not really sure that with the technological development that's ongoing today, somebody, some rogue scientist or whatever, will say, I don't care. I mean, it's not as if there is a scientific police with the United Nations that can go and stop whatever development is going there. It's just a matter of having funds or not having funds, but you can be sure that Richard Branson or another, some very incredibly rich people that looks like a 007 villain is going to fund that kind of research and is going to do something that nobody in the right mind would do.
Yeah, I think you already gave the answers. You know?
Hola, muy buenos días. También muy interesado en la conferencia. La pregunta, bueno, ya metido en temas polémicos, quería preguntarles a los dos ponentes cuál es su postura. Por ejemplo, empiezan a salir muchos temas de ciencia ficción y demás, pero creo que un problema real que atañe a la robótica y que tiene que ver un poco tal vez con la postura de los investigadores es el asunto de los drones, de drones, que por ejemplo pues empiezan a desarrollarse y inclusive están creando grandes compañías en Estados Unidos que empiezan a vender drones en diferentes gobiernos del mundo. Solo quisiera saber como su postura ante este tipo de desarrollo que tiene que ver con la robótica.
I have a very simplistic answer. I don't think drones are robots in the sense that they lack a huge amount of autonomy. The last I heard, 4 people needed to, to control a drone. So it's a very, very sophisticated, powerful weapon. For me, this is not a robot yet, but you may have a different opinion.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very definite issue. I mean, I'm not really an expert. I mean, there are actually people working on autonomous drones that have autonomous. They have vision systems. You know, they have different kinds of sensory systems, so they can actually make sense. They can actually map the environment. They can develop, evolve maps, and they can use the maps to navigate. Now, like most of the technologies, this can be used for, let's say, good purposes, but it also can be used for negative purposes. I think that's for any kind of technology, and there's basically no way in which, I mean, originally computers were developed mostly for military purposes, and now the driving, let's say, the driving force is no longer the military in computer development, but it's like, you know, the entertainment industry, it's the communication, you know, the bandwidth that we need, and, you know, we want to have pictures and movies and all that stuff. That has been the real push now for the communication technology. Now, at the moment, it is still the case that in robotics, the military are, you know, the real pushers of this technology, and of course they will also push the drones technology, and they have, of course, they have a lot of money. Hopefully in the not too distant future, there will be other purposes that will drive the robotics development. I can see that when we get more into service robotics, also if we can augment the level of automation in manufacturing, I think the real driving forces will no longer be the military, at least I would hope, will no longer be the military, but will be, you know, sort of civil, more interesting purposes. But yeah, it's a real issue, I mean, which has been around for a long time.
Okay, since you're mentioning the incrementing capacity of manufacturing, so you probably have heard about the technological singularity, in which human is able to create a machine that's smarter than the smartest of humans. That's been projected into the future, maybe 15, 20 years from now, who knows. The problem is that as soon as that happens, they can start to develop machines that are even more intelligent, and everything goes through the window, and nobody knows what will happen. Of course, we're not talking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about artificial life, but I was wondering that if there's going to be some kind of life singularity in which we're going to create something, artifacts that are going to be, let's say, will have a higher fitness that we do, and they will occupy all technological niche. So
okay, I have an answer to that, but I think this is for Gusz.
It's for both.
No, please go ahead.
No, I think this is for the artificial life people.
But I just didn't really get the point. So is it a question or is it a statement?
It's a question. I mean, of course, that there is going to be a singularity or not is a matter of opinion. You can't really affirm that somebody someday is going to create something that's even more is smarter than the smartest of humans, and we will be able to create even smarter artifacts. That's opinion, or not. I mean, so the question is: do you think that there will be a technological singularity? Do you think that there will be a life singularity? They will happen at the same time. They will happen the one before the other, the one after the other.
I'm not more qualified to answer this question than anybody here. But if it was up to me, I said yes, it will happen. It will certainly happen, and it might happen in this century. Yes.
So I would say whatever that means. I mean, we all know the discussion about the IQ, the intelligence quotient, which measures, it's one single number. Imagine that. Look at how complex a human being is, and we put one single number on that individual and say, well, this characterizes the level of intelligence, and then we're going to have robots in the future that will, you know, have a higher what IQ. I mean, it's about as stupid saying, well, they're going to be more intelligent. Currently we have machines for almost anything we can do that can do this particular task faster, better, more cheaply, more accurately, and they don't tire.
But they can't do anything else.
Huh?
But they cannot do anything else.
They can't do anything else. But then for the else, we have another machine that can also do that better, faster, more cheaply. And so the question is, you say, well, it will happen. I think it will be also a question of whether, I mean, if we look at a human being, the way we do things, and we think of the screwdriver example, we can do many, many things, but we can't do anything really well. You know, there are machines for most things. Let me say most things. I see the skeptical look by artists, but we can do most things with machines better than humans can do it. So why should we try to make a copy of a human being that is maybe slightly better than the human being if we don't get a benefit, you know, if they do things as stupidly as we do the things? So there is an economic component to this, whether the kind of research will be funded, and maybe the future is more into specialized machines rather than, you know, trying to approximate human beings and go in that sense beyond human beings, even though it's not clear at the moment what that really would mean.
I'll tell you why I think that it will happen, and that is going through two examples. The grand challenge for artificial intelligence in the 70s was to build the chess-playing computer, which is now the quiz-playing computer, you know, a TV quiz-winning computer. So that was the grand challenge to AI. And there is another one of robotics or AI or whatever. It's building the world champion soccer player robotic team, which would beat the world champion human soccer player team.
No way,
so,
Spain, no way.
So somehow there will be somebody coming up with a challenge, which is okay, we had this disembodied challenge in AI, and then we have this embodied challenge, and then there will be a new challenge that people will address. So just try to see whether we can do it.
Okay, I think we will, in a high note, I would like to thank Professor Rolf Pfeifer. I would like to thank Gusz. I think we had a very interesting roundtable. Thank you very much for being there. Thank you very much for your question. I think that's it. We'll meet again at 4. Is that correct? Meet again at 4 o'clock right here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much.